Section 1. The language nobody noticed. So, let's just start at the very beginning, because the beginning is where The Simpsons hid something most people walked right past without ever knowing it was there. When the show first aired in December of 1989, most viewers were paying attention to the obvious things. The animation style, which was deliberately rough and jagged in ways that felt intentional, like someone had drawn a family on a napkin and decided to leave it exactly like that. The voice performances, which were doing something genuinely strange for primetime television at the time, leaning into a kind of flat Midwestern register that made everything sound both absurd and completely real at the same time. And the writing, which was operating at a frequency that most primetime audiences had never encountered before, jokes that existed on several levels simultaneously, so that the same line would make a 10-year-old laugh for one reason and their parent laugh for an entirely different one. But underneath all of that, threaded through the dialogue and the background details and the tiny moments that existed for maybe 2 seconds before the camera moved on, there was another layer of the show happening. A layer that wasn't meant for everyone. A layer that was being constructed carefully and deliberately by a group of writers who were, by any reasonable measure, some of the most intellectually overqualified people who had ever worked on a primetime animated sitcom in the history of American television. And this layer expressed itself through language. Specifically through the way the show used words, references, and hidden linguistic signals that were designed to reward the kind of viewer who was paying close enough attention to notice them. The first and most quietly persistent example of this is the way Springfield's residents speak to each other using what linguists would recognize as deliberate register shifts. Homer Simpson's vocabulary, the actual words he chooses, changes depending on who he's talking to in ways that most viewers never consciously register, but that their brains absolutely pick up on. When Homer talks to Marge, his syntax simplifies. When Homer talks to Mr. Burns, he becomes slightly more formal, not because the show is trying to make him seem intelligent, but because it's capturing something true about the way working-class people unconsciously adjust their language when they're in the presence of authority. This is a real sociolinguistic phenomenon, and the writers were aware of it and were encoding it into Homer's speech patterns from the very beginning. It's not played for laughs, it's just accurate, and it's there. The town of Springfield itself is named after Springfield, Oregon, which Matt Groening has confirmed, but the name was chosen for a specific reason that goes beyond geographic familiarity. Springfield is the most common city name in the United States. There are Springfields in nearly every state. By choosing that name, the show was immediately doing something that no other animated series had attempted at the time, which was to make its setting linguistically resistant to being pinned down. You couldn't ask where Springfield was and get a sensible answer, and the name was part of why. Springfield wasn't a place. It was a word that belonged to everywhere. But the name games went deeper than the town itself. Take the Simpson family name. Groening has said he chose Simpsons partly as a play on the word simple, a gentle nod to the idea that this was meant to be an ordinary family, an everyman household. But the name also contains something else when you look at the full cast of Springfield, because the show's secondary characters are named in patterns that the writers were very deliberate about. The Flanderses take their name from a region of Belgium, with deeply embedded cultural associations around duty, piety, and the endurance of suffering, which is an almost comically precise fit for a character whose entire arc is about being good in a world that punishes goodness. Patty and Selma Bouvier share a last name with the French automobile brand, and the show makes exactly one joke about this, which is that their family crest apparently features a car. But the Bouvier name also connects to Jacqueline Kennedy's maiden name, which is either a coincidence or a very subtle nod to the idea that Marge's family considers itself a cut above, something the sisters' attitudes confirm across dozens of episodes without the show ever needing to state it directly. Dr. Nick Riviera's name is a joke that operates on several levels at once. Riviera suggests the Mediterranean coast, which suggests wealth and leisure and things being pleasantly fine, which is the exact opposite of every medical outcome Dr. Nick has ever produced. The Rivera spelling variant connects to Diego Rivera, the muralist, which creates a funny visual dissonance if you think about it, because Diego Rivera created enormous, detailed, meticulous works about the complexity of human existence, and Dr. Nick has killed or nearly killed approximately everyone who has ever visited his office. And then there's the Nick itself, which in British slang means to steal, and doctor, Nick does operate what amounts to a medical practice built on that principle, specifically the theft of patient safety and the theft of money in exchange for services that do not function. Principal Skinner's name, before the revelation of his real identity, is itself a buried Easter egg once you know what to look for. B.F. Skinner, the behavioral psychologist, is the father of operant conditioning, the theory that behavior is shaped through reward and punishment. Seymour Skinner runs an elementary school where children are managed through exactly this system, with detention and gold stars and the various mechanisms of behavioral control that public schools use. The name isn't subtle when you know what you're looking at, but it's invisible until you do, which is how the best Easter eggs work. Krusty the Clown's real name, Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yerucham Krustovsky, is a dense construction of Yiddish and Hebrew naming conventions that places him in a specific cultural and religious tradition. Herschel is a diminutive of Hirsch, the Yiddish word for deer. Pinchas is a genuine biblical name. Yerucham means compassion or mercy in Hebrew, which is particularly interesting for a character whose relationship with the children who adore him is defined primarily by indifference. The name Krusty itself is a diminutive that suggests something unpleasant on the surface while being used as a term of affection within the fiction of the show, which is exactly what Krusty's relationship with his audience is. He's cynical and self-destructive and genuinely not very good at caring about anyone, and his name captures that contradiction in a single word. Sideshow, Bob's full name is Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. The middle name Underdunk is a word that doesn't exist in standard English, which is the joke, but it exists in the show's universe as an inherited family name passed down from his father, who appears in a later episode and is exactly as theatrical and insufferable as Bob himself. The last name Terwilliger is a genuine American surname with Dutch and German roots that was probably chosen for the way it sounds, simultaneously pompous and slightly ridiculous, like the name of someone who was born believing they deserved more than they received. Bob is, at his core, a man defined by that exact feeling. He was Krusty's sidekick. He should have been the star. He has the education, the culture, the talent, and he got the pie in the face while the inferior clown got the love. His last name sounds like someone's ego stumbling over its own feet, and that's not an accident. The show's use of language as an Easter egg delivery system goes well beyond character names. There are entire episodes where the dialogue contains linguistic jokes that are invisible unless you have a specific piece of knowledge the show is assuming you might have. In the episode where Homer joins the Stonecutters, the Secret Society's chant includes a reference to keeping the metric system down, which is a joke about American exceptionalism in measurement standards, but it's also a specific reference to the long-running political argument in the United States about whether to adopt the metric system, an argument that has been going on since the 1970s. The show treats it as one of the great petty grievances of American institutional life, alongside owning the British crown jewels and controlling the media. These things are listed as equivalent concerns, which is itself the joke, but the metric system reference has a specific sharpness to it that suggests one of the writers had real feelings about this particular subject. Homer's obsession with food, and specifically with donuts, is an Easter egg that operates on a mythological level that the show is almost certainly aware of. The donut, or torus shape, is a topological form with significance in mathematics and physics, and the show has made explicit reference to this in at least one episode where Homer works out a theory about the shape of the universe using a donut as his model, and cosmologists have since suggested that the universe might actually have a toroidal structure. The show understood from fairly early on that Homer's donut was functioning as a symbol of something circular and self-consuming, a thing that brings momentary pleasure and leaves you in exactly the same place you started, which is a fairly accurate description of Homer's life as a whole. The language the show uses for its recurring visual gags also contains hidden layers. The itchy and scratchy cartoons that appear within the show are themselves Easter eggs about the history of animation. Itchy is named for Ignatz Mouse, the character from George Harriman's Crazy Cat comic strip, which was one of the foundational works of American cartooning and which depicted a relationship between cat and mouse defined by violence and ambiguity that the affection underneath never quite resolved. Scratchy, the cat, is the eternal victim in a way that deliberately inverts the power dynamics of most cartoon cat and mouse relationships, because in Itchy and Scratchy, the cat never wins and the mouse never experiences consequences for the extraordinary violence it commits. This is a commentary on the structure of classic animation, where the weak character always triumphs over the strong one, but Itchy and Scratchy strips away the comedic redemption arc and just shows you the violence without the punchline, which is its own kind of dark joke about what those old cartoons were actually depicting if you remove the upbeat music and the springy sound effects. There are hidden words embedded in the show's animation itself. The Simpsons has, across its run, hidden written messages in places that are technically visible but practically impossible to read at normal viewing speed. Background signs, text on posters, writing on chalkboards in the background of school scenes, labels on products Homer is eating, small print text on newspapers that various characters hold up and then put down before the camera lingers long enough for a viewer watching in real time to read. These were not always intended to be read. Some of them were put there by animators as inside jokes for each other, messages that might be seen by someone pausing the tape in the VHS era or freezing a frame in the DVD era, but which were designed to exist in the show's world without necessarily existing for the audience. They are Easter eggs in the purest sense of the term, hidden objects that require specific effort to find and that reward that effort with something the show wasn't broadcasting openly. The very first season contains a sign in the background of Springfield Elementary that, when paused and read, reveals a list of school rules that includes regulations that no real school would ever need to put in writing, which tells you something specific about what kind of school Springfield Elementary is and what has happened there in the past to necessitate those particular rules. The rules are funny in isolation, but they're also a portrait of an institution in a state of ongoing mild crisis, run by a man who is himself a walking mild crisis, presiding over a student body that includes at least one child who has survived a nuclear near miss, a skateboarding injury that would have hospitalized an adult, and more teacher-involved emotional damage than most therapists see in a decade of practice. There's a deeply buried linguistic Easter egg in the way Springfield's local media operates. The Springfield Shopper, the town's newspaper, has had several different taglines across the show's run, and each one is doing something slightly different. The most famous is probably the headline that announced Homer's death with the wrong person's name, which was a joke about the newspaper's fundamental incompetence. But the paper's background presence in the show also serves as a running commentary on the state of local journalism, which The Simpsons was satirizing long before the collapse of local print media became the defining story of the American news industry. The Springfield Shopper is a paper that exists primarily to get things wrong in ways that cause additional problems for the characters, and the show was sketching a portrait of that institutional failure 20 years before most readers experienced it firsthand. Kent Brockman, Springfield's television news anchor, has a name that is itself a compressed Easter egg. Kent is an ancient English county name that also functions as a very American white-collar first name, and Brockman contains Brock, which is an archaic English word for a badger, an animal associated with obstinate persistence and territorial behavior. Kent Brockman is absolutely an obstinate and territorial figure in Springfield's media landscape, a man who has been covering the same town for decades and has developed the particular kind of journalistic entitlement that comes from being the biggest fish in a very small pond. The show's use of the word embiggen, later followed by cromulent, is one of the most famous Easter egg-adjacent moments in the show's history, because those words entered actual English usage after their appearance in the show. Embiggen is now in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. A cartoon invented a word that became real, which is the kind of thing that sounds like it shouldn't be possible but has happened multiple times throughout the show's run. The word cromulent itself means something like adequate or acceptable in a way that sounds better than it is, and the show deployed it to describe a word that the show had just invented, which is a joke about the self-referential nature of authority and legitimacy. Something sounds cromulent because we've decided it does, and the decision to decide is itself all the authority the decision requires. Running through all of this, underneath every name and every sign and every throwaway line that contains a reference to something the writers thought was worth encoding, there is a consistent philosophy about what the show is doing with language. The Simpsons treats words as containers that hold more than their surface meaning. It assumes its audience is capable of holding multiple interpretations simultaneously. It plants things that don't announce themselves, that don't demand to be noticed, that simply exist in the fabric of the show and wait for the right viewer to come along and find them. Every episode of The Simpsons is operating on at least two linguistic registers at once. The surface register is the one that produces laughs within the first 3 seconds of a scene. The deeper register is the one that produces a different kind of recognition later, sometimes much later, sometimes years later when you're doing something entirely unrelated and a specific combination of words crosses your mind, and suddenly you understand what the joke was actually saying. The show spent 36 years building a language inside a language, and most of it is still sitting there in the background of scenes you've already watched, waiting for someone to press pause at exactly the right moment and read what's written on the wall. If you're watching this late at night or early in the morning, wherever you are in the world, drop your location and time in the comments. There are people watching this from places you'd never expect. And if this is the kind of content you want more of, subscribing means you'll be there when the next one arrives. Section 2. The Chalkboard Confession. The chalkboard gag is the first thing you see in the opening of every Simpsons episode that uses one. Before the couch, before the family assembles, before Homer's car pulls into the garage, Bart is standing at a chalkboard in his classroom, writing the same sentence over and over in the tradition of school punishment, each line identical to the one before it. Most people absorb this as wallpaper, a familiar transition element, the thing that happens before the show really starts. But the chalkboard gags are not wallpaper. Looked at carefully, across the full archive of the series, they constitute one of the most sustained pieces of concealed communication in the history of American television. The format was established in the show's first episode and has remained structurally identical across more than 3 decades. Bart writes a sentence. He writes it many times. The sentence describes something Bart has apparently done or said that has resulted in this punishment. The camera pulls back, the credits roll, and the show continues. What changes every single week is the sentence itself. And in those sentences, the show has been doing things that the main narrative rarely gets the chance to do. From the very beginning, the writers used the chalkboard as a space where the show could say things it couldn't say anywhere else. A place where the fourth wall was thin enough to press against. A space that existed slightly outside the narrative frame, which meant the rules of the narrative didn't quite apply there. The chalkboard was where the show could be honest in ways that a primetime sitcom format didn't normally allow. The earliest chalkboard gags are the most straightforwardly punitive. Bart writes things like, "I will not waste chalk," which is a joke about the inherent absurdity of detention as a disciplinary mechanism because the punishment is being deployed to address an infraction that the punishment itself then commits. He writes, "I did not see Elvis," which in the early seasons was a reference to the Elvis sighting culture that had been part of American tabloid life since the late 1970s, but which also does something interesting in the context of a children's television program. It positions this 10-year-old boy as needing an alibi. Alibi? For what exactly? The show never says. It just establishes that Bart needs one. By the second and third seasons, the chalkboard gags had evolved into something more sophisticated. The writers began using them as spaces for real-time cultural commentary that was too sharp or too topical to work inside the episode's narrative without disrupting the story. Bart writes things that function as compressed editorials, takes on American institutional life that are delivered in the voice of a child being punished, which amplifies them in interesting ways. When a child is forced to write a sentence over and over again, the form implies that the sentence contains a truth that needs to be drilled in. The repetitive writing is a mechanism of correction. But what happens when the sentence being written is itself a critique? Bart has written, "I will not fake seizures" on the chalkboard. He has written, "I am not a 32-year-old woman." He has written, "I will not call the principal Spudhead." These are funny because they establish that these things have happened, that there is a history behind each punishment, that somewhere in the unshown timeline of Bart Simpson's life, there was a day when he faked a seizure in a context that required official sanction. The chalkboard gags are archaeological evidence. They are the residue of events the show never depicted, a record of a childhood that exists only in negative space. The ones that cut deepest are the gags that feel specifically aimed at someone. Bart has written, "I will finish what I sta," with the sentence cutting off mid-word, which is a joke about his attention span but also a formally perfect piece of visual comedy. a truncated punishment that enacts the very failure it was meant to address. He has written, "I will not torment the emotionally frail," which is the kind of sentence that makes you stop and wonder which specific instance of emotional torment generated enough administrative concern to result in a chalkboard consequence. Some of the chalkboard gags are clearly responses to events happening in the world outside the show. The production timeline of The Simpsons is such that there's typically a gap of several months between when an episode is written and when it airs, which means the chalkboard gags, written close to the end of production, are often the most topical element of any given episode because they have the shortest lead time. Writers have used the chalkboard to address real-world events in a compressed, Bart-voiced register that gives the commentary a specific flavor, the flavor of a kid who has been caught doing something wrong and is being made to reckon with it publicly. Bart has written "Ralph won't morph if you squeeze him hard enough," which is a very specific mid-90s reference to the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, a show that was at the time dominating children's television and generating the kind of anxious parental discourse about children and violence that The Simpsons had been generating slightly earlier. The joke is multiply-nested. It's a reference to a competing show, it's a comment on how children actually interact with media properties, and it's positioned as the result of a punishment, which implies that Bart did try to morph Ralph Wiggum and discovered through empirical testing that the morphing did not occur. The chalkboard has also been used to settle scores, or at least to acknowledge that scores exist. Bart has written, "I will not expose the ignorance of the faculty," which is the kind of sentence that a principal who has been embarrassed by a student might require without thinking through what the sentence is actually saying. By making Bart write that sentence as punishment, Principal Skinner has inadvertently created a public record of a moment when a child successfully exposed the ignorance of Springfield's educational institution. The sentence is its own evidence. There are chalkboard gags that are about the show itself in ways that feel almost uncomfortably direct. Bart has written, "I will return the seeing eye dog," which is funny in the abstract but becomes stranger when you consider that someone on the writing staff sat in a room and decided that the show's punishment framing device should, this week, imply that Bart Simpson has possession of a seeing eye dog that does not belong to him. The image that creates the dog, the presumably blind owner, the child who has somehow ended up in custody of an assistance animal, is a complete scene that was never written, a story that exists entirely in the margin of the cold open. One of the most quietly devastating chalkboard gags in the show's history appeared during a period when the series was navigating the death of Phil Hartman, the voice actor who had played Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, two of Springfield's most beloved recurring characters. The show addressed the loss in the only way it had available in that moment, not through a memorial episode or an explicit acknowledgement in the main narrative, but through a brief, quiet departure from the usual punishment format. The chalkboard said what the episode couldn't bring itself to say any other way. The chalkboard has had gags that were written by guest writers, by celebrities, by producers who had grievances they needed to air in that particular format. It has contained jokes in different languages. It has contained a sentence written in a programming language, which was placed there by someone in the production who understood that a subset of the audience would recognize it, and a larger portion would not. The ones who recognized it got a joke. The ones who didn't got the visual rhythm of Bart writing repetitive text, which is all the joke requires to function on its most basic level. There is a specific chalkboard gag that fans have identified as one of the most technically precise pieces of dark comedy the show has ever produced. In an episode where the story carries a fairly heavy emotional weight, the chalkboard gag at the top of the episode contains a sentence that, read literally, describes something that couldn't possibly have happened, but that when you think about the emotional logic of the episode, becomes a kind of perfect summary of what the episode is actually about. The writers put the theme of the episode into the cold open as a punishment sentence, in a form that looked like a throwaway gag, knowing that anyone who watched the episode and then went back to the beginning would find the sentence sitting there, having already told them everything. The pacing of the chalkboard gags has changed across the show's run in ways that reflect broader changes in how the production thought about the format. Early chalkboard gags are shown for long enough that you can read the sentence multiple times as Bart writes it. Later ones go by faster, which reflects both the production's understanding that audiences had been conditioned to understand the format without needing the full visual duration, and a gradually increasing confidence in what the gag could communicate in very little time. The most recent chalkboard gags sometimes appear for only a few frames, just long enough for your eye to register that a sentence is being written, which means you're reading them slightly after the image has passed, reconstructing the text from the afterimage in a way that makes the experience of reading a chalkboard gag feel appropriately dreamlike. Some episodes have no chalkboard gag at all. These omissions are not random. The episodes where the cold open skips the chalkboard and goes directly to the couch tend to be episodes that are doing something formally unusual. Episodes where the show is drawing attention to its own structure in a way that requires one of the established structural elements to be absent. If you notice that an episode doesn't have a chalkboard gag, that noticing is part of the episode's design. The show wants you to notice. There's a chalkboard gag that simply reads a sentence that appears to make no sense whatsoever. One of those gags where the grammatical structure is intact, but the semantic content creates a kind of brief, pleasant confusion. Bart writes it with the same even rhythm as all the others, the same patient repetition, and the result is that the punishment format lends a kind of formal dignity to something that is, on its face, complete nonsense, which is either a meditation on the nature of institutional authority or a joke that a writer found funny at 2 a.m. and which made it through the production process intact. Sometimes those two things are the same thing. The physical environment of the chalkboard itself has changed subtly over the series. The classroom has been redrawn multiple times as the animation style evolved, and the positioning of the board, the size of Bart's writing, the exact shade of chalk green that serves as the background have all shifted in ways that are invisible unless you watch a very early episode immediately after a very late one. The chalkboard that Bart stands at in 1990 is not quite the same piece of furniture as the one he stands at in 2020, but the sentence structure is the same. The rhythm of the punishment is the same. By now, the chalkboard gag has outlasted most of the cultural phenomena it has referenced. It has outlasted the television shows it mocked, the politicians it satirized, the controversies it weighed in on. It has outlasted 3 decades of changes in what American children watch and how they watch it. And Bart is still there, and the chalk is still there, and the sentence is still being written. The chalkboard is the smallest formal space in the show, and it might be the most honest one. It says what the episode can't say in dialogue, what the writers can't say in the story, what the show can't say in the main narrative. It says it in the voice of a child being punished for having said it before, and it says it over and over, in that specific even handwriting, until the bell rings and the episode begins and whatever the sentence was about becomes part of the permanent record of a show that has been confessing things in plain sight since December of 1989. Section 3. The couch that remembers everything. Before the show begins each week, before the plot starts, before the characters have problems that need resolving, the Simpson family runs home. They run through the front door, they pile into the living room, they land on the couch, and then something happens. Something unexpected, something strange, something that ranges from mildly surreal to completely dreamlike depending on what the show felt like exploring that week. The couch gag plays, and then the episode begins, and the couch gag sits in memory as the thing that happened before the story. In the first season, the couch gags were simple. The family runs in and crowds onto the couch, and the gag is usually something physically wrong with the result. One extra family member appears from nowhere, or they pile on in the wrong order, or Homer ends up on the floor. These were designed to fill time, primarily. The show had a variable length problem in its earliest episodes, where the runtime of the main story would sometimes land short of the broadcast slot, and the couch gag was a flexible length section that could be made longer or shorter to compensate. The earliest couch gags are the ones that run for a few seconds and do one simple thing. They exist to pad time while also being genuinely funny, which is a harder problem to solve than it sounds. But something happened in the second and third seasons. The writers and animators realized that the couch gag was a space with no rules. The main body of each episode is constrained by continuity, by character logic, by the need to tell a story that makes narrative sense within Springfield's established world. The couch gag is constrained by nothing except the requirement that it end with the family on the couch. Everything between the beginning and that landing is free space, and the show began filling that space with increasingly ambitious ideas. The first time the couch gag abandoned physical possibility entirely, something changed. Once you've established that the laws of physics don't apply in those opening seconds, you've also established that the couch gag can contain anything. The family can arrive to find the couch occupied by the characters from a different show. The couch can be located in space. The whole sequence can be animated in a different style, using a different technique, by a different artist. The couch gag became the show's Artist in Residence program, a short slot where something genuinely experimental could happen before the regular programming resumed. Guest animators began doing couch gags. Studio Ghibli did a couch gag. Banksy did a couch gag. Don Hertzfeldt did a couch gag. Each of these is a universe unto itself, a fully formed piece of work that happens to end with a family sitting down to watch television. The Ghibli couch gag is a pastoral fantasy that has nothing to do with The Simpsons except the character designs. The Banksy couch gag is a piece of anti-capitalist performance art that uses the show's own imagery against itself, depicting the production facilities in overseas sweatshop conditions, with workers assembling merchandise and preparing content in conditions that are the direct visual inverse of the glossy entertainment being produced. The couch gag was, for those 90 seconds, using the show's own opening ritual to indict the show's own economic conditions. Don Hertzfeldt's couch gag from 2016 is the show commenting on its own potential senescence in a way that has no equivalent in television history. The sequence depicts a future in which The Simpsons still exists, but has been distorted almost beyond recognition by decades of change. The characters' names have shifted subtly. Their faces have become wrong in specific ways. The color palette has faded and then brightened to garish extremes. Homer's voice addresses the audience with language that would fit in a Beckett play. The family sits on the couch. The future stretches out, bleak and endless and weirdly funny. Then the regular episode begins, and the contrast between the Hertzfeldt vision and the show's usual visual grammar makes the regular episode feel briefly strange, as though you've just returned from a place where the rules were different. The couch gag has referenced almost every major cultural touchstone of the past 30 years. It has referenced silent film. It has referenced oil paintings. It has referenced video games in ways that required the animators to reconstruct the visual language of specific games accurately enough that players of those games would recognize them. It has referenced abstract expressionism, though the family members didn't know that's what was happening. It has referenced the paintings of Magritte on multiple occasions, because The Simpsons has a specific, recurring relationship with Magritte, the man who painted the pipe that was not a pipe, the man who made paintings about the gap between representation and reality, whose work sits in an interesting relationship with a show that is itself a representation of a reality that has never existed. There is a couch gag where the entire history of life on Earth is depicted in sequence, starting with the formation of the planet and proceeding through the evolutionary timeline to the emergence of the Simpsons family, who arrive at the couch and sit down. The gag is about 3 minutes long, which makes it one of the longest in the show's history, and it is technically a recap of 4 billion years of natural history that ends with 5 animated characters watching television. The joke is in the proportion, all of that time and all of that complexity, and the culmination is Homer on a couch. But the gag is also doing something more interesting, which is asking what it means that we think the culmination of that history should look like anything in particular. Maybe Homer on a couch is exactly the right culmination. Maybe the 4 billion years led here on purpose. Some couch gags are deeply personal to specific writers or animators in ways that are invisible unless you know what to look for. A couch gag that depicts the family as Renaissance-style painted figures is a reference to a specific museum that one of the writers visited and found genuinely moving, and the detail in the Renaissance-style rendering reflects actual research into the period's painting techniques rather than a general approximation. The joke would work as a general parody. The specificity is for someone else, for anyone who happens to have the right piece of knowledge to unlock it. There are couch gags that reference previous couch gags in ways that create a continuity within the form itself. If the couch gag is a sequence in which the family arrives to find the couch already occupied by an earlier version of themselves, there's a joke about time and repetition built into the structure. But there's also an acknowledgement that this moment has happened before, that the running to the couch has been happening for decades, that there is a history inside this 30-second sequence that most viewers feel without being able to articulate. The couch remembers. Every time the family lands on it, they're landing on the accumulated weight of all the times they've landed on it before. The theatrical film used the couch gag format in the opening sequence in a way that was specifically designed to reward the people who had been watching the show for 18 years by the time the movie arrived. The theatrical version of the couch gag is essentially a series of callbacks and escalations that only work if you have the context of 2 decades of couch gags in memory. For someone seeing it cold, it's a fast-moving sequence of visual jokes. For someone who had been watching since 1989, it was a compressed history of the form, a greatest hits sequence that also contained new material that fit seamlessly into the retrospective. The couch gag has been used as a mechanism for addressing real-world events in ways that the main body of the show can't easily accommodate. When a season premieres after a significant event, a cultural moment, a tragedy, something that has changed the context in which the show is being watched, the couch gag is often the place where the show acknowledges it most directly, because the couch gag exists in a space slightly outside the story. It can be about the world without requiring Springfield to address the world. Springfield's world is eternal and self-contained. The couch gag is where the real world gets to knock on the door. There are couch gags that have never been seen by most American viewers of the show because they aired in international markets that received different versions of the cold open sequence. These gags exist. They're documented. They are part of the canon of the couch gag tradition. They've just never been centralized or easily accessible in the way that the standard broadcast versions have been. Some of them were produced specifically for specific markets and contain local references, local jokes, visual material designed for an audience that would understand contextual details that an American audience might not. They are Easter eggs that are Easter eggs in the most literal sense possible, hidden objects that you could only find if you happened to be in the right place at the right time. The most formally radical couch gags are the ones that abandon the family entirely. There are couch gags where no member of the Simpson family appears at all, where the sequence depicts something happening to the couch itself, or to the living room, or where the camera approaches from outside and shows you the house from a perspective that the show almost never uses. These gags reframe the familiar image by removing the familiar characters, which creates a specific kind of uncanny feeling, because you're seeing the set without the actors, the stage without the play. The couch just sits there. The room is empty. And then the episode begins. In some of the later seasons, the couch gag has been used as a direct address to the audience in ways that feel unusually candid. There are gags where Homer or another family member explicitly acknowledges that they're performing a ritual, that this is the couch gag, that you are watching the couch gag, and the self-awareness is played either for comedy or for something that sits close to genuine pathos depending on the episode. These are the moments where the show is most clearly thinking about its own age, its own duration, the fact that it has been doing this for longer than many of its current viewers have been alive. The couch is the center of the Simpson home in a way that is both literal and symbolic. It faces the television. The family faces the television. The audience, watching, faces the family facing the television. This tripling of the viewing act, the audience, the family, the television within the show, is something the couch gag has played with repeatedly, sometimes with great sophistication, and sometimes with a kind of cheerful obviousness, but always with awareness. The show knows what the couch means. The couch is where stories are received. The couch gag is where that receiving begins. And after more than 30 years, it has become the most familiar threshold in American television, a doorway that millions of people have crossed so many times that the crossing itself is part of what they came for. Every couch gag is a small argument about what television can do with its own conventions. Some of them lose that argument beautifully, and some of them win it. All of them are the show remembering, every week, that it began with something strange and has been trying to stay strange ever since. Section 4. Names that were never accidents. Springfield is a town built on nomenclature. The names of its streets, its institutions, its businesses, and the people who inhabit all of them have been selected, arranged, and sometimes invented from scratch with a degree of care that most viewers assume applies only to the main characters. But the secondary characters of Springfield, the background figures, the recurring faces, the minor players who appear in 2 or 3 episodes a decade and are given a line or two before the camera moves on, these people have names that are doing real work. The entire geography of Springfield is constructed from names that encode meaning. Evergreen Terrace, where the Simpsons live, is named in a way that creates an interesting tension with the family that occupies it. Evergreen suggests permanence, vitality, something that continues to grow even in cold seasons. The Simpsons are not quite the family that name would imply. Homer has been fired, demoted, and nearly killed at a rate that most actuarial tables would consider statistically impossible. The house has been damaged, haunted, renovated disastrously, and once briefly moved on a flatbed truck. The terrace part suggests a suburban gentility that the neighborhood has never quite achieved. Evergreen Terrace is an aspirational address, and aspiration is one of the show's most consistent subjects. The school that Bart and Lisa attend is Springfield Elementary, which is the most deliberately generic name the show could have chosen and is therefore funnier than any more specific name would have been. It is not the Lincoln Elementary School or the Theodore Roosevelt Academy. It is the Elementary School of Springfield, described purely by its function and its location, which is itself a portrait of the institution. Springfield Elementary is a school that does exactly what its name says it does, and nothing more. It provides elementary education to the elementary citizens of Springfield in a building that looks like every public school that has ever existed in a medium-budget animated series about working-class America. Shelbyville, Springfield's neighboring town and perennial rival, has a name that contains an Easter egg for anyone who knows the history of American place naming. Shelbyville is a real name used by several American cities, but in the context of the show it functions as a mirror of Springfield, an alternate reality where slightly different choices were made and slightly different people ended up in charge of things. The rivalry between the two towns is the show's way of exploring what American civic identity actually looks like when you strip away the romanticism, which is to say, it looks like two groups of people in adjacent zip codes believing, for reasons they can no longer fully articulate, that the other group is worse. Moe's Tavern, the bar where Homer and his friends drink, has a name that is doing several things simultaneously. The name Moe is short for Morris, which is a name with roots in the Latin Mauritius, suggesting someone dark or from the land of the Moors, which is an interesting background for a character who is depicted as Eastern European in origin and who practices a specific kind of American barman's philosophy that involves equal parts cynicism and genuine, buried affection for his regulars. Tavern, rather than bar, is itself a word choice. Tavern implies a more traditional establishment, something older and more rooted, which fits the visual appearance of Moe's, which looks like it has been in operation since before most of its customers were born and will continue operating long after they're gone. Mr. Burns' full name, Charles Montgomery Burns, is one of the show's most carefully constructed character names. Charles is the name of royalty. English kings named Charles have appeared at various points throughout European history, and the name carries an association with inherited authority and the particular kind of comfortable arrogance that inherited authority produces. Montgomery is a military name, associated with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who commanded Allied forces in the Second World War and was known for a combination of tactical brilliance and personal insufferability that Burns would recognize and admire. Burns itself suggests both burning, fire, destruction, the fundamental violence underneath his corporate gentility, and Robert Burns, the Scottish poet, whose work is about ordinary people and the landscapes they inhabit, which is about as far from Mr. Burns as it's possible to get and is therefore funny. His first name is an aristocrat's name, his middle name is a conqueror's name, and his last name belongs to a poet of the people. Smithers's first name was established relatively late in the series as Waylon, which is itself an Easter egg for anyone who knows American country music. Waylon Jennings was one of the founding figures of outlaw country, a genre defined by a rejection of the polished Nashville establishment in favor of something rawer and more authentic. Waylon Smithers is a man who has devoted his life to serving the establishment's most establishment figure, a man whose authentic self has been comprehensively suppressed in favor of professional function. The name Waylon is the life he didn't live, pressed into the corner of his identity where it sits and occasionally tries to surface. Ned Flanders' first name refers to the biblical figure Nedahiah, a minor figure from the books of Chronicles who was a son of the line of David and appears exactly once in Scripture before disappearing. The obscurity of the reference is the point. Ned is a man defined by genuine faith that is consistently untested by the actual text of the tradition he follows. He knows the rules, he follows them, but his relationship to the deeper narrative is something the show has always found interesting to probe. His last name, Flanders, connects to the Belgian region discussed earlier, but also to John McCrae's poem In Flanders Fields, one of the most widely read poems about the First World War, which is about the dead asking the living to continue their struggle. Ned Flanders, husband of Maud, who does die in a later episode, is a man surrounded by the memorializing of loss in ways that his relentlessly cheerful demeanor is designed to contain. Krusty the Clown's full name is Herschel Schmoikel Pinchas Yerucham Krustofsky. The surname Krustofsky is a Yiddish-inflected construction that places Krusty in a specific cultural and religious tradition, which becomes the basis for entire episodes later in the series, when his relationship with his rabbi father becomes central to his character. But the name Krusty itself is a diminutive that suggests something unpleasant on the surface, while being used as a term of affection within the fiction of the show, which is exactly what Krusty's relationship with his audience is. He's cynical and self-destructive and genuinely not very good at caring about the children who adore him, and his name captures that contradiction in a single word. Milhouse Van Houten is named after President Richard Nixon, whose middle name was Milhouse, spelled slightly differently but close enough that the connection is obvious and intentional. The decision to name the sensitive, anxious, frequently humiliated best friend of the show's main character after one of American history's most famously paranoid presidents is a very specific choice. Nixon's presidency was defined in many ways by insecurity and a belief that enemies were everywhere, and Milhouse Van Houten shares exactly this psychological profile. He is a child who expects the worst, and is usually right to expect it. Nelson Muntz's last name comes from a metallurgical process. Muntz metal is an alloy of copper and zinc that was developed in the 19th century and named after its inventor, and it's a relatively obscure piece of industrial history that most people who've watched hundreds of Simpsons episodes have never connected to Nelson's last name. The connection, if intentional, suggests something about Nelson, an alloy character, a mixture of elements, harder and cheaper than pure copper, useful but not refined. Or it's just a name that sounds right for a bully, and the metallurgical connection is a coincidence that someone in the writer's room found funny enough to retain. Lisa Simpson's name is the one that rewards the most careful attention. Lisa is a diminutive of Elizabeth, which means pledged to God. And while Lisa is the most overtly non-religious member of the family at various points across the show's run, there is something in her name that suggests a calling or a purpose that she is in the process of discovering. The Simpson part returns to simplicity, to plainness, and Lisa is in constant creative tension with the plainness of her context. She is the most extraordinary person in a setting designed to prevent extraordinary people from flourishing, and her name says both of these things at once. Bart's name is an anagram of brat, and that choice was deliberate and stated by Groening early enough that it became part of the cultural record. But Bart is also a short form of Bartholomew, which is a New Testament apostle's name. The apostle Bartholomew is notable primarily for the manner of his death, flayed alive, which has been depicted in art as an extraordinarily painful martyrdom. Whether the writers were thinking about the flaying of St. Bartholomew when they named the 10-year-old brat who attends Springfield Elementary is genuinely unclear, but the layers are there if you go looking. Marge's name is short for Marjorie, which is related to Margaret, which derives from the Greek word for pearl. The pearl is a gem formed inside a shell as a response to an irritant. A small foreign body enters the oyster and the creature wraps layer after layer of material around it until something beautiful emerges from what was essentially a defense mechanism. Marge Simpson is, across the run of the show, exactly this kind of figure. She is the center of the family, the one around whom the disorder and the chaos and the occasional glory wrap themselves, and something genuinely beautiful emerges from the process even when the process is difficult. Her name is either an accident or the best piece of unconscious symbolism in the history of American animated television. The Wiggum family name has a specific resonance in early American history. The Wiggums were a real family in Massachusetts colonial records. Chief Clancy Wiggum's first name, Clancy, is strongly associated with the Boston Irish police tradition, and the full name creates someone who sounds exactly like the name of a man who takes up too much space and moves through the world with the confidence of someone who has never been asked to account for himself. His son Ralph Wiggum's name carries a slang meaning that the show cannot possibly have been unaware of, and Ralph's own relationship with language and meaning is one of the show's most consistently funny running observations, a child for whom words arrive in configurations that suggest a completely different organizing principle from the one everyone else uses. The Bouvier sisters' first names, Patty and Selma, are both old-fashioned American names that peaked in popularity in the first half of the 20th century, which is appropriate for characters who seem to have been formed in a different era and are managing their relationship with the present through cigarettes and willful narrowness of interest. Their shared last name connects them to Marge, but everything else about them is designed to establish a contrast with Marge's warmth and openness. They are the same raw material shaped differently, which is exactly what the Bouvier name is doing in the show. The same source producing wildly different results depending on what you do with it. The name of Homer's father, Abraham Simpson, is the most overtly symbolic name in the family tree. Abraham is the founding patriarch of the Abrahamic faiths, the man who was asked to sacrifice his son, the figure around whom an enormous tradition of faith and obligation and family loyalty has been organized for thousands of years. Grandpa Simpson has failed at virtually every version of the paternal function. His relationship with Homer is one of the show's longest-running sources of sadness. The name Abraham hangs over all of that failure with the specific irony of a man who has access to a tradition of patriarchal greatness and who has not managed to deliver on any of its promises. Section 5. The background is the story. There is a scene in a very early Simpsons episode where the camera is following a conversation in the foreground, tracking two characters as they talk, and in the background, not quite out of frame but far enough back that most viewers' attention wouldn't naturally rest there, something is happening that has nothing to do with the scene and everything to do with the show's broader world building. A background character is reading a newspaper. The headline is visible for approximately 1 second. If you freeze the frame, the headline is not about anything happening in the foreground or the episode. The headline is a completely separate story about something that has happened or is happening in Springfield's world, and the newspaper exists in that background for 1 second and then the scene moves on. This is the background of The Simpsons, and the background is where the show hides some of its deepest material. The animators and writers of The Simpsons developed, over the course of the early seasons, a shared practice of using background detail as a second story running parallel to the episode's main narrative. This wasn't the result of a formal policy or a memo from a showrunner. It emerged organically from the culture of the production, where people cared about the coherence of Springfield as a place and wanted that coherence to be visible even when the main camera was busy somewhere else. Television signs in Springfield are among the most densely packed sources of background Easter eggs in the show's history. Whenever a television appears in a scene, in the living room, at a bar, in a store window, at a bowling alley, the screen contains something. Sometimes it's a parody of a real show. Sometimes it's an original program that exists only within Springfield's media landscape. Sometimes it's a news ticker scrolling information that has nothing to do with the current scene but that establishes something about the state of the world outside the room. The televisions in Springfield are never showing static. They are always transmitting. And the shows they're showing have names, and the names are jokes, and the jokes are often better than a viewer watching at normal speed will ever catch. One of the most famous background television Easter eggs occurs during a scene where Homer watches a news broadcast, and in the lower portion of the screen, a news ticker visible for only a few seconds contains a completely unrelated story about a series of improbable events that, when listed in sequence, describe a trajectory of municipal decline so specific and so detailed that it seems impossible it was generated as a throwaway background joke. The ticker was written by someone who thought about what Springfield's news would actually cover if the show had time to cover it, and then packed that thinking into a visual element that most viewers would never see. The books that characters carry, leave on tables, or have visible on their shelves in the background of scenes are another rich layer of hidden content. Lisa's room, in episodes where the camera has a clear line on her bookshelves, contains titles that are doing real work. The books visible on her shelves in different episodes reflect her intellectual development over the series in ways that are technically consistent. The books from her early childhood are different from the books visible in later seasons when she's a few years older. This degree of continuity in background prop design is unusual for any television production and remarkable for an animated one, where every frame requires deliberate choices about what will be visible and where. Homer's toolbox, seen occasionally in episodes set in the garage or basement, contains tools with labels that include internal jokes and references to actual people on the production crew. This is a tradition in film and television production, hiding crew names and props, but The Simpsons has done it with particular density. If you could freeze every frame of the show that includes the toolbox and read every label, you'd find something like a partial employee directory of the show's production team spanning 3 decades. The refrigerator in the Simpson kitchen is a deep archive. The drawings on the refrigerator door change between episodes in ways that are both random and deliberate. Some of the drawings attributed to Bart or Lisa are original artwork produced by the show's artists, and some contain hidden content. There are refrigerator drawings that, when examined closely, appear to be parodies of specific real artworks. There are drawings that contain words written in a childlike hand that become legible only when you pause the image and hold the frame. One of these drawings, in an episode from the middle seasons, contains what appears to be a complete map of a small area of Springfield that doesn't appear in the main animation, drawn in crayon with the specific inaccuracy of a child who is representing space as they understand it rather than as it exists. The map has streets. The streets have names. None of the names match any street that appears elsewhere in the show. The exterior of Springfield's various businesses changes subtly over the course of the series in ways that no single viewer is likely to track across hundreds of episodes, but that become visible when episodes are compared side by side. Stores open and close. Signs change. Building facades acquire and lose details. Some of these changes are continuity errors, genuine accidents of the animation process. Others appear to be deliberate. Businesses that have failed between episodes, establishments that have expanded, new signs that replace old ones. Springfield is a town that has an economic life happening in the background, while the Simpsons family lives its foreground life, and the background economics are occasionally visible if you know where to look. The hallways of Springfield Elementary contain lockers, and those lockers have locks and combinations that appear on the locks. In at least one episode, the combinations visible on locks belonging to named students are numbers that, when decoded using simple substitution ciphers, produce words that describe those characters. Nelson's combination produces a word associated with toughness or violence. Lisa's produces a word connected to music. Bart's produces something that the show couldn't use in dialogue without parental advisories, but that appears on a combination lock in a school hallway as a string of numbers that most viewers would not think to decode. The paintings and artwork visible in the background of various Springfield locations are another layer of the show's visual humor. Mr. Burns's office contains paintings that parody specific old masters, but the parodies are accurate enough to the originals that you have to know the originals to get the joke. The paintings in the Springfield Art Museum, which appears in several episodes, include parodies of works from the Impressionist period that are rendered with enough fidelity to the original styles that the artists who created them clearly did reference research. These are jokes that were made by people who had looked at the actual paintings, understood how they worked, and then did the work of reproducing the technique at a level accurate enough to support the parody. Moe's Tavern contains, in the background behind the bar, a collection of bottles whose labels change between episodes and between different angles within the same episode. Some of these labels are for real beverages, some are for fictional Springfield products, and some, when read carefully, are for products whose names are puns or references that operate on a different register from the scene being filmed. There is at least one bottle in the background of Moe's that, in a specific episode, has a label that is a direct reference to the episode's main plot, presented as a brand name, visible for less than a second in the far background, while a conversation about something entirely different happens in the foreground. The church where the Simpsons occasionally attend services contains stained glass windows that have been the subject of considerable fan analysis. The images in those windows include scenes from scripture, but also, in some of the later episodes, scenes that correspond to events in Springfield's history that the show has depicted across its run. The stained glass at the First Church of Springfield appears to have been updated between early and late episodes, as though the church's congregation has commissioned new windows to commemorate significant local events. This is either very careful background design or a continuity error that happens to be consistent in a meaningful way, and the difference between those two things is sometimes genuinely uncertain. The cemetery that appears in several episodes contains headstones with inscriptions that are visible in close shots and that contain both jokes and genuine sentiment. There are headstones for characters who have died in the show's history, and the inscriptions on those headstones reflect the writer's understanding of who those characters were. There are also headstones for characters who are alive elsewhere in the same episode, which are either dark jokes about mortality or animation errors, depending on your interpretive generosity. Some fan wikis have cataloged every visible inscription in every cemetery scene the show has produced, and the result is a kind of unofficial Springfield obituary archive that exists nowhere in the show explicitly, but is entirely constructed from background detail. Grocery stores in Springfield, seen in episodes where characters shop for food, have shelves stocked with products whose names follow a consistent internal logic. The store brand products at the Springfield Quick E-Mart have names that are portmanteau constructions of real brand names with Springfield-specific modifications. Krusty O's are the show's version of a major breakfast cereal brand, but more specifically a vehicle for jokes about how heavily licensed products marketed to children often have more to do with the licensor's financial interest than with the product's actual quality. The box of Krusty O's that has appeared in multiple episodes contains, on its back panel, small text that includes what appears to be nutritional information, and the nutritional information in at least one episode lists ingredients that are technically possible, but that no regulatory body would ever approve for a children's cereal. The physical structure of the Simpson house itself is one of the show's most persistent background Easter eggs. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace does not follow consistent spatial logic. The number of rooms changes between episodes. The basement appears in some episodes and is absent in others. The second-floor bedroom configuration shifts. The backyard is sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, sometimes contains the treehouse, and sometimes does not. This inconsistency has been the subject of enormous fan analysis, and the conclusion is that the house is not meant to be a consistent physical space, but rather a set of rooms assembled for narrative convenience, each room being exactly the right size and configuration for the story being told that week. But within this deliberate inconsistency, there is a consistent detail that the show has maintained across thousands of episodes. The position of the television in the living room relative to the couch. The couch faces the television. The family faces the television. Whatever else changes about the room, the couch and television relationship is invariant. The show is organized around this axis. The background shifts around it, but the thing itself doesn't move. Springfield's skyline, visible in establishing shots across the decades, is another background document. The skyline changes in ways that reflect the economic and narrative history of the town, buildings appearing and disappearing between episodes, the nuclear plant's cooling towers always present, always dominating, the one constant in a skyline that is otherwise subject to the same willful inconsistency that governs Springfield's internal geography. The plant is the fixed point. Everything else orbits around it. Section 6. What the writers hid in the credits? At the end of every episode of The Simpsons, the credits roll. If you watch the show in its original broadcast form, before streaming services restructured the credits into smaller corners of the screen, these credits contain a significant amount of text, moving at a pace designed to compress as much information as possible into a limited time, while remaining technically readable by anyone who is actually reading. Most television viewers don't read the credits. The credits are the indicator that the show is over, the cue to change the channel, or get up from the couch, or begin whatever activity was deferred during the viewing experience. The people who read the credits during a Simpsons broadcast are a small subset of an already large viewing audience, and it's for this subset that the credits have been, across the show's run, a space for additional content. The most famous credit Easter eggs in The Simpsons are the pseudonyms. The writers and producers of the show have, throughout its history, used false names in the credits for specific episodes. This is a tradition in television production that dates to the use of the pseudonym Alan Smithy, which became the agreed-upon name that directors used when they wished to disown a film. The Simpsons developed its own parallel tradition, using the credit roll as a place to insert names that were jokes, anagrams, commentary on the production process, or references to internal disputes that the audience would never know about unless they happen to read the credits carefully and then cross-reference the listed name against the show's actual staff. The pseudonym tradition includes writers who chose names that were anagrams of their real names, names that were references to obscure cultural touchstones, and names that were simply funny in a context where the credit was for a specific position on the production. Someone credited as animation director for an episode that was animated unusually might take a pseudonym that was a gentle joke about animation. Someone who wrote a script that was significantly rewritten by the showrunner might take a pseudonym that expressed, in compressed form, their feelings about the collaborative process. The production codes that appear in the credits for each episode are another layer of hidden information. Each episode of The Simpsons has an alphanumeric production code that was assigned during production, and these codes follow a system that has been partially decoded by fans over the years. The codes indicate the season, the episode's position in the production order, and occasionally other information about the episode's production history. Episodes that were held and aired in a different season than they were produced sometimes have production codes that, when read in the context of the airing season, create interesting gaps or anachronisms that document the show's internal logistics in ways that no other public record does. More interesting than the production codes are the copyright notices. The copyright line at the end of the credits has, in various episodes, contained small variations from the standard text that were noticed by fans who were reading carefully. Some of these variations are typographical errors that survive the final cut. Others appear to be deliberate alterations, additional information embedded in a line of text that most viewers treat as boilerplate. Identifying which variations are errors and which are intentional is a genuine interpretive challenge, because the people who made them are not always willing to confirm what they intended. The music credits at the end of each episode contain references to the show's relationship with its musical heritage that go deeper than most viewers know. The Simpsons has used more licensed music across its run than almost any other animated series, and the credits for episodes that contain musical performances or recognizable songs include specific attribution details that are themselves sometimes jokes. A song credited to a particular artist in a way that uses the artist's full formal name when the informal name would have been more recognizable is either a clerical choice or a comment. The care with which certain credits are worded and the carelessness with which others appear to be formatted is itself meaningful in a production where most decisions were deliberate. Danny Elfman's theme for the show is credited in every episode, which is standard practice, but the specific wording of the credit has changed subtly over the decades of the show's run in ways that mirror the changing relationship between the production and its composer. Elfman composed the original theme in 1989 for a fee that has been reported as relatively modest, given the theme's subsequent cultural impact. It is one of the most recognizable pieces of music on American television, played and referenced and parodied in contexts around the world, and Elfman has spoken about the experience of hearing it played in contexts that require payment to everyone except its creator. The credit remains. The theme remains. The relationship between the two continues to evolve. The episode dedications that appear in some seasons of the show are themselves Easter eggs of a sort. When The Simpsons dedicates an episode to someone, usually a member of the production who has died, or occasionally a historical figure with a connection to the episode's subject, the dedication appears at the end of the credits in small type, and it's not always announced or promoted in advance. Finding the dedication requires reading all the way to the end of the credits, which the show knows most viewers won't do. This means that the dedication is, in some sense, private, a message addressed to the audience but designed to be received only by the portion of the audience that was paying closest attention. The legal text that appears in the credits is normally ignored because legal text is designed to be ignored. The Simpsons has, on several occasions, used the legal text as a location for additional jokes. Text that is technically a disclaimer or a rights reservation has been written with a specific choice of words that transforms it into something slightly different from standard legal language while remaining technically functional. The joke requires the legal reading to be understood first, which means it requires a reader who is parsing the text for information rather than scanning it for visual texture. There are episodes where the credits contain what amount to spoilers for future episodes, hidden in the names and descriptions of production roles. If a character's name appears in the additional character section of an episode's credits, but that character hasn't appeared in the episode, It sometimes means the character was cut from the episode during editing, and their appearance is deferred to a future episode. This has led to fans who read credits carefully, knowing about planned character appearances weeks or months before those appearances occurred. Whether this was intentional, whether the production was using the credits as a teaser mechanism, is another interpretive question that the show has declined to answer directly. The end cards that appear after the credits in some episodes are the most visible form of post-credit Easter egg, and they range from simple jokes to elaborate constructions that require the full context of the episode to parse. The most famous end cards are the ones that appear after Treehouse of Horror episodes, where the horror framing means that the end card often continues the horror aesthetic in a way that the credits don't explicitly signal. You have to actually stay through the credits to encounter the end card, and the end card often contains content that advances or complicates the episode's themes rather than simply closing them. Writers who have left the show under difficult circumstances have, in some cases, made their final contributions visible in the credits in ways that weren't noticed until later. A showrunner departing after a contentious creative period will sometimes have their farewell episode credit them in a way that contains a message for anyone who understood the context. These aren't always hostile messages. Sometimes they're expressions of genuine affection for the show, delivered in the only form available at the end of a working relationship, a line of text in a credit sequence that most people won't read. There is also the matter of what happens when a performer dies and the show continues. The credit for a voice that no longer exists, appearing in episodes recorded before the death or in episodes that use archival material, carries a specific weight that is not present in any other credit context. The name in the credits is a memorial, and it is a memorial that most of the audience will never read. The show has handled these moments in credits with varying degrees of deliberateness, but the fact of the credits as a permanent record means that every performer who has ever been credited in The Simpsons is preserved there, in those rolling names, in every subsequent rerun and re-release and streaming availability of the episodes they appeared in. The credits don't end, they accumulate. The Simpsons credits have been running since 1989. If you read every episode's credits in full, every name, every code, every variation in standard language, every dedication, you would be reading a partial history of 36 years of television production, told from the perspective of the people who made it. The main text of the show is about the Simpsons family. The credits are about everyone else. Section 7. Celebrity cameos and what they were really saying. There is an episode of The Simpsons in which Michael Jackson appears. He plays a large, soft-spoken white man from New Jersey named Leon Kompowski who claims to be Michael Jackson, and he is voiced in the original broadcast by Michael Jackson himself, though neither the episode nor the show's official materials acknowledge this for several years. The character is in a mental institution when Homer first encounters him, admitted because he told people he was Michael Jackson and nobody believed him, which is itself a joke about celebrity and credibility that lands differently depending on what you know about who is actually speaking the dialogue. The episode, titled Stark Raving Dad, is one of the most analyzed in the show's history, and the Michael Jackson question, which is to say the question of what it means that the real Michael Jackson agreed to appear in this context, has become more complicated over time rather than less. Jackson wanted the appearance to be uncredited. He performed under the name John J. Smith in the original materials. The voice that says, "I am the greatest entertainer in the world," and sings a birthday song to Lisa is Michael Jackson's, operating through a fiction, claiming to be a man who claims to be Michael Jackson. The nested layers of that structure are so carefully constructed that the whole thing reads like a hall of mirrors. The episode's central Easter egg is the relationship between Leon Kompowski's arc and Michael Jackson's real life at the time of filming. The episode aired in September 1991. Jackson was at the absolute peak of his commercial success, surrounded by a kind of protective isolation that the public was only beginning to become aware of. He chose to appear in this episode as a large, gentle man who is incarcerated for telling people who he is, and who is ultimately revealed to be not quite what he claimed. The parallels are there if you look for them. Jackson was apparently aware of them, and this was the performance he chose to give. The Beatles had a complicated relationship with The Simpsons that produced one of the show's most quietly significant celebrity moments. Paul McCartney agreed to appear in the episode Lisa the Vegetarian, on the condition that Lisa's vegetarianism be treated as a permanent character change, that she would not revert to eating meat after the episode ended. As so many Simpsons character developments are reversed for the sake of the status quo, the production agreed. Lisa Simpson has been a vegetarian in every subsequent episode. McCartney got a character development locked into the show's canon in exchange for a guest appearance, and the canonical change has now persisted for almost 30 years. The Easter egg in this is what McCartney's condition tells you about the episode. A guest star who cares enough about a character trait to negotiate for its permanence is a guest star who has thought seriously about the show's treatment of the subject. McCartney wanted Lisa's vegetarianism to be treated with respect as an identity rather than a plot device, and by securing that treatment as a contractual condition of his appearance, he ensured that every episode of The Simpsons produced since 1995 implicitly honors that position. Lisa's vegetarianism is not a joke. It's a trait the show treats with genuine seriousness, and the reason it's treated that way is that a musician who sang Yesterday and Blackbird and Let It Be made a specific demand before he'd agree to appear in a cartoon. Stephen Hawking appeared in The Simpsons multiple times across his lifetime, and each appearance is a carefully constructed Easter egg about the relationship between scientific celebrity and popular culture. The show consistently positioned Hawking as someone who is not only brilliant, but aware of his own celebrity and willing to play with it. In one episode, Hawking encounters Homer and finds in him an echo of his own thinking about the structure of the universe. This is a joke, but it's a specific joke. The idea that Homer's accidental genius might brush up against Hawking's deliberate genius in a way that produces a moment of genuine recognition is also a comment on how intelligence distributes itself across humanity in ways that don't respect social class or educational background. Hawking's recurring appearances also contained a running gag about his wheelchair's capabilities that escalated with each visit. The wheelchair, in the show's logic, became increasingly capable between episodes. New features were added, new functions revealed. This is the show's way of expressing genuine affection for a man who is himself a real person with a real wheelchair through the language of cartoon physics, which allows things to work better than they do in the actual world. Johnny Cash played the Coyote Spirit Guide in the episode El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer. This is an episode in which Homer eats extremely hot chili peppers at a chili cook-off and has a vision quest, guided through the surreal landscape of his subconscious by a magical talking coyote. The coyote is the spirit guide of the American Southwest, a trickster figure in indigenous traditions, a creature associated with transformation and the questioning of established order. Johnny Cash, by the time of this appearance, had undergone his own cultural transformation. The American recordings era was re-establishing his reputation as something far deeper and stranger than his commercial peak had suggested, and the darkness and depth of Cash's voice lent the coyote a spiritual quality that the episode required. The coyote tells Homer things. It asks him questions about who his soulmate is, about whether he knows the person who truly understands him. The questions are delivered in Johnny Cash's voice, which is to say they are delivered with the weight of a man who has lived long enough to know that these are not simple questions. The episode is, underneath its pepper-induced surrealism, a genuinely moving story about loneliness and connection, and the choice to voice the figure that asks the deepest questions with a voice that sounds like it has already found some of the answers, is one of the show's most perfectly calibrated casting decisions. Kelsey Grammer, who voices Sideshow Bob, is himself an Easter egg of a kind. Grammer had been playing Frasier Crane since 1984, and his casting as Sideshow Bob, a character who is defined by theatrical overeducation and the belief that his gifts have been wasted on an unappreciative public, is either a coincidence or a piece of commentary about the relationship between the character Grammer was known for and the character he was being asked to play. Frasier Crane believes he is better than most of the people around him. Robert Terwilliger Jr. believes the same thing and has a considerably more active response to the disappointment of not being recognized. The voice that plays both of them is the same voice. Elizabeth Taylor agreed to appear in The Simpsons for the episode where Maggie Simpson speaks her first word. The arrangement of this appearance is an Easter egg in itself. Maggie's first word in the show's continuity is daddy. It's a word that appears at the very end of the episode, after Homer has spent the episode struggling with a sense that he is not valued by his family. Maggie says daddy and the episode ends. The word is said by Elizabeth Taylor, whose voice career at this point in her life was not extensive, who agreed to provide a single word for this moment. The production specifically sought Taylor because they wanted a voice that would carry weight, that would make the moment feel significant, and Taylor's agreement meant that the first word Maggie Simpson ever spoke was spoken by one of the most famous women who had ever lived. A single word, daddy. Spoken once, and then never repeated in the show's main continuity. The celebrity cameos in The Simpsons are Easter eggs, not just because of who appears, but because of why they agreed to appear. When a major figure in American culture chooses to appear in a cartoon, the choice itself communicates something about their relationship to their own image, their willingness to be satirized, their understanding of the show's cultural position. Some celebrities have declined to appear. The ones who agreed form a specific portrait of who, in the last 30 years of American public life, was comfortable enough with complexity and self-awareness to sit in a recording booth and become a version of themselves filtered through Springfield's particular lens. The scientists and intellectuals who appeared in the show did so in a mode distinct from the entertainers and politicians. When a physicist or a mathematician or a public intellectual appeared in Springfield, the show was usually making a specific argument about the relationship between specialized knowledge and popular culture, about the ways that genuine expertise gets processed by the entertainment industry and what gets lost or transformed in that processing. The show genuinely respected scientific and intellectual achievement, and the Easter egg in these appearances is often that the scientist or thinker was allowed to be right about something in an episode where almost everyone else is wrong, a subtle but consistent pattern of affirming the validity of expertise in a context that is generally skeptical of authority. The most elaborate celebrity Easter egg in the show's history may be the episode that featured a specific ensemble of musicians who, in the real world, had complex interrelated histories of collaboration, conflict, and influence on each other, and the episode staged its fictional interactions between these characters in ways that mirrored those real-world dynamics, without ever stating them directly. A viewer who knew the music industry history being referenced would experience the episode as a layer cake of actual relationships transposed into a fictional context. A viewer without that knowledge would experience it as a straightforward story about musicians in Springfield. Both readings are available simultaneously, and the show provided neither the context to access the deeper reading nor any signal that the deeper reading existed. This is the most sophisticated thing the celebrity appearances do. They make two different shows available simultaneously, one for the general audience and one for whoever happened to possess the specific knowledge the show was assuming. The celebrity is the Easter egg. Their presence in Springfield is a code, and the code resolves into a different story depending on what you bring to the decryption. Section 8. Treehouse of Horror's Secret Continuity. Every October, something shifts. The Halloween episode arrives, and Springfield becomes a different place. One where the rules don't apply, where the dead walk, where children collect candy and adults disguise themselves as things they're afraid of. The Treehouse of Horror is The Simpsons at its most formally free. The annual space where the writers could do anything because the horror anthology format established that none of it was real, none of it counted. The characters could die because the deaths didn't need to be honored next week. Except that something has been accumulating across the show's more than 30 Treehouse of Horror episodes that resembles continuity whether or not it was planned as such. The first Treehouse of Horror aired in October 1990 and established the format. 3 short horror stories told by Bart, Lisa, and Homer in a treehouse, with a framing device that the kids were telling scary stories on Halloween night. This framing device was largely abandoned after the first few years. The anthology format survived, but the treehouse itself faded as the structural container, and the stories became increasingly free of the domestic anchor. By the middle seasons, Treehouse of Horror episodes were opening with elaborate pre-credit sequences that were themselves complete short films, parodies of horror genre conventions that established the episode's aesthetic before the 3-story structure began. The opening sequences of Treehouse of Horror episodes have become their own tradition within the tradition. They reference specific horror films, horror genre tropes, and occasionally the show's own history in ways that assume a viewer who has been watching long enough to have context for the references. The gravestones that appear in several opening sequences contain names of characters from the show's history, including characters who died within the Treehouse of Horror universe and characters whose deaths in the main series were significant enough to be memorialized. The graveyard in the Treehouse of Horror opening is a compressed archive of the show's losses. Kang and Kodos, the two aliens who appear in nearly every Treehouse of Horror episode, are themselves a running Easter egg about the relationship between Simpsons continuity and canonical impossibility. In the main series, encounters with Kang and Kodos are treated as things that happened. Homer has been abducted, Springfield has been threatened, an alien has posed as a presidential candidate. In the Treehouse of Horror universe, these events clearly cannot be incorporated into the main series because the events around them include other impossible things. Kang and Kodos thus occupy a position between two continuities, simultaneously within the show's world and outside of it, which is a formal position that the show has never quite resolved and which may be unresolvable. The political commentary encoded in the Kang and Kodos storylines is among the most direct political content the show has ever produced. The episode where the aliens abduct Bill Clinton and Bob Dole and pose as them during the 1996 presidential election is a piece of political satire about the two-party system that is so direct in its thesis that it's remarkable it aired on a major broadcast network. Kang, posing as Clinton, delivers a speech in which he promises to further the progress of the human race, and when his alien nature is revealed and an audience member suggests voting third party, Kang responds that the audience will be throwing their vote away. Everyone votes for the alien who wins. The human civilization continues under alien management. The point of the joke is not subtle, and it has aged in ways that the show probably didn't anticipate when it was written. The specific horror film parodies within Treehouse of Horror episodes are Easter eggs in the most concentrated form the show produces, because they require the audience to know the source material well enough to appreciate both the accuracy of the parody and the specific choices the show made in adapting it to Springfield. The Shining parody in Treehouse of Horror V is probably the most analyzed, because Kubrick's film is one of the most analyzed films in cinema history, and the Simpsons segment engages with it at a level of visual and narrative specificity that goes beyond general parody into something that seems to have been made by people who had watched the source film multiple times and thought carefully about what it was doing. The episode restages specific Kubrick compositions. Homer's axe through the door recreates the original frame. The maze sequence in the snow restages the Overlook's hedge maze. The red rum joke is there, but the show does something more interesting than simply reversing the word. It has the moment of revelation occur at a different narrative beat than the original, which changes the function of the reveal from horror to comedy without losing the specific visual logic that made the original moment work. This is a parody made by people who understood the original well enough to know where to change it and why those changes would work. There is a secret visual consistency across the Treehouse of Horror episodes that has been documented by obsessive fans. The color palette of each segment within each episode follows the visual language of the horror subgenre it's invoking. Gothic horror sequences lean warm and shadowed, with the amber-brown palette of old Universal monster films. Science fiction horror sequences use the cooler, blue-white tones of 1950s science fiction cinema. Psychological horror sequences use desaturated, slightly unreal color that refers to the aesthetic of films like Rosemary's Baby. These choices are not accidental. The animators on these episodes understood that color does work in horror, that genre signals can be carried in a palette before a single monster has appeared or a single scary sound has been played. The death count within Treehouse of Horror episodes is itself a running joke that has accumulated significance over decades. The show tracks, in an unofficial way, how many times Homer dies in Treehouse of Horror specifically. The number is large. Homer has been killed by monsters, by his own family members, by falls, by machines, by supernatural forces, by the laws of physics operating in unusual ways. The deaths are presented each time as if they're final, as if this is the end of Homer Simpson, and then the next segment begins, and Homer is alive and present. This is the show's clearest engagement with the idea that animated characters can be killed without being removed, that death in this universe is a temporary narrative state rather than a permanent condition. But something interesting happens across the full run of Treehouse of Horror episodes when you look at which characters die and how often. The pattern is not random. Homer dies most frequently, but Homer's death is also the least emotionally loaded, the most clearly a joke. When other characters die, when Lisa dies, when Marge dies, when characters whose deaths would have real emotional weight in the main series are killed in Treehouse of Horror, the show handles these deaths differently. There's a shift in tone, a slight change in how the scene is written and paced, that acknowledges the difference between a death that is a vehicle for a specific joke and a death that the show actually takes seriously even within the context of a horror anthology where nothing is supposed to count. The guest voices in Treehouse of Horror episodes have their own hidden history. Horror actors who appear are often doing work that engages specifically with their positions in the horror canon. A famous horror voice actor doing a Treehouse guest spot is not just doing a cameo, they're extending a conversation between the show and the genre that produced them. The show's horror parodies are affectionate toward their sources in a way that makes them feel collaborative rather than simply derivative, and the casting choices reinforce this. The people who made the original work are often involved in the reproduction of it. The musical cues in the Treehouse episodes form their own Easter egg sequence for musically attentive viewers. The show's approach to horror music has evolved across the Treehouse run from direct quotation of recognizable horror film scores to something more original and specific to the show's own musical identity, and this evolution traces a gradual process of the show developing its own horror vocabulary rather than borrowing one from the genre. The early Treehouse episodes leaned on recognizable horror musical tropes because the show needed the association with the genre to establish the register. The later ones lean on musical ideas that are specific to The Simpsons' own universe, using horror music that is primarily in conversation with the show's own history rather than with the horror genre's traditions. This is an Easter egg about artistic maturation that is audible only to someone who has followed the musical choices closely enough to track the transition. The deepest Easter egg in the Treehouse of Horror tradition is the one that reveals what the horror versions of these characters are made of. The horror of Treehouse of Horror is never random or external. It emerges from the same sources as the comedy of the regular episodes. The shitting segment is funny and then scary and then funny again because it's Homer dealing with isolation and pressure in the way Homer always deals with things, by escalating, by losing control, by doing the most extreme version of what he was already inclined toward. Take the horror elements away and you have a regular Homer episode. Add them back and the horror makes sense, because the sources were always there. The Treehouse episodes are not a departure from the characters. They are the characters with the volume turned all the way up, and what you hear when everything is amplified is still, unmistakably, the show. Section 9. The Numbers. The Simpsons is not a show that most viewers would describe as preoccupied with mathematics. It is, in its visible identity, a show about a family, about a town, about the specific texture of American middle-class life, rendered in bright colors and sharp dialogue. Numbers, when they appear, are usually prices or addresses or ages that exist to ground the fiction in specific rather than approximate reality. But the show was created and staffed, particularly in its first decade, by people with unusual levels of mathematical and scientific training. The writer Al Jean holds a mathematics degree from Harvard. David X. Cohen, who worked on the early seasons before creating Futurama, has advanced degrees in theoretical computer science. Several other writers from the show's peak era had quantitative academic backgrounds that were atypical for comedy writers at the time, and those backgrounds left traces in the show's fabric that are visible to viewers with the right training. The most famous mathematical Easter egg in the show's history is an equation that appears on Homer's chalkboard in the episode where he briefly becomes a mathematical genius, which real mathematicians have confirmed, does actually predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle to reasonable accuracy. The fact that this equation is fully functional, that it represents genuine mathematics rather than a plausible-seeming arrangement of symbols, means that someone on the production had to actually do the math, had to work out what a real equation predicting that specific value would look like, and then render it accurately in the background of a scene. The joke exists on the surface as Homer writes complicated equations. The Easter egg underneath is that the equations work. 14 years after the episode aired, when the Higgs boson was confirmed by experiments at the Large Hadron Collider, a physicist reviewing the equation noted that it had gotten surprisingly close to the actual value within the margin of error that would be reasonable for the period in which the episode was written. A comedy writer had done better physics than some physicists. The Euler identity, one of the most celebrated equations in mathematics, appears in the background of at least one Simpsons classroom scene in a context that makes it seem like generic mathematical decoration. For a mathematician, its appearance in that specific context carries weight. The Euler identity is considered the most beautiful equation in mathematics by a significant portion of the mathematical community, a formula that connects 5 of the most fundamental constants in mathematics in a single relationship. Placing it on a schoolroom wall as background decoration is a joke about mathematical education, about the way profound beauty in mathematics gets rendered into wallpaper in the educational context, and it's a joke that only functions for the viewer who knows what they're looking at. The show once contained what appeared to be a reference to Fermat's last theorem in the background of a scene, depicting a numerical relationship that appeared to contradict the theorem. A proof of Fermat's last theorem, one of mathematics' most famous problems, had been completed just before the episode aired, and the apparent counterexample shown in the background was not a genuine counterexample, but a very large near-miss designed to fool a viewer who checked it with a calculator, but that would fail at a level of precision beyond what most calculators can display. The show was testing its audience with a fake mathematical Easter egg, a piece of bait that would reward checking but would reveal, on sufficiently close examination, that the numbers didn't quite work. The real Easter egg was the act of checking. The phone numbers in The Simpsons have a complicated history as Easter eggs. Early episodes used numbers beginning with 555, the standard American television convention for fictional phone numbers. Later episodes began playing with phone numbers in ways that either acknowledged the 555 convention as a convention, used numbers that when dialed connected to actual promotional hotlines, or used numbers that appeared to be functional but were selected for reasons that included internal references to specific significant numbers in the show's production history. The Simpson family's address, 742 Evergreen Terrace, has been dialed as a phone number by fans and produced various results over the show's run, depending on what year the attempt was made and what area code the caller was using. The recurring number 1138 has appeared in the show multiple times in various forms. 1138 is a reference to George Lucas's first film, THX 1138, which is itself a reference to a student film he made earlier, and which has since become one of the most widely referenced Easter eggs in American pop culture. It appears in Lucas's own films, in films made by people who admire Lucas, in television series, in video games. The 1,138 inches The Simpsons is a contribution to a tradition of celebrating a specific piece of cinema history that is also a tradition of hiding the same number in as many contexts as possible to see who notices. Statistical concepts appear in the show with enough frequency and accuracy that they constitute another layer of hidden educational content. There are episodes where probability is discussed by characters who understand it well enough that their probability estimates are actually correct, alongside episodes where characters make the classic human errors of probabilistic reasoning, the gambler's fallacy, the availability heuristic, the misunderstanding of base rates, and the show treats these errors accurately, not exaggerating them for comedy, but depicting them with the precision of writers who understood the real phenomenon they were satirizing. The population of Springfield, which is never stated consistently across the show's run, fluctuates in ways that have been documented by fans tracking it across episodes where the number comes up. The fluctuations are too wild to be explained by simple writing inconsistency, suggesting instead that Springfield's population is genuinely variable, that the town expands and contracts depending on the narrative requirements of specific episodes, that Springfield has exactly as many people as it needs for the current story, and that number is always the right number, even when it contradicts a number from a previous episode. Population is a narrative tool rather than a fixed fact, and the Easter egg is in recognizing that the inconsistency is purposeful rather than careless. The price of a Krusty Burger, tracked across the show's many decades, is an economic Easter egg. The show is set in a perpetual present where the characters don't age, but prices of goods visible in background scenes have changed across the show's run in ways that approximately track real American inflation. A Krusty Burger that costs a certain amount in 1990 costs more in 2000 and more still in 2010. The changes are not consistent enough to be a deliberate economic tracking exercise, but they're consistent enough that they can't be entirely accidental. Someone was paying attention to the price of things and making sure that Springfield's economy, however fantastical in other respects, followed the basic logic of real-world price movement over time. The donut count across the show's run, were anyone to compile it, would constitute a document of Homer's emotional history. The show's approach to depicting Homer's food consumption has been remarkably consistent in its numerical depiction. Homer's relationship with food follows patterns of escalation and retreat that track with his emotional arc in specific episodes. The specific quantity of donuts in a given scene is sometimes a visual signal about Homer's current psychological state, with higher quantities indicating higher levels of distress and lower quantities suggesting, in the rare episodes where Homer is genuinely content, that the consumption is pleasure rather than self-medication. Counting Homer's donuts across the show would produce a chart that looked like a cardiograph of his emotional history. The show's episode count, which passed 700 before any other scripted primetime series in American television history, is itself a number that the show has acknowledged and played with. Various milestone episode counts have been the subject of self-referential episodes or credit sequences, and the choice of which milestones to mark and which to pass silently tells you something about which numbers the show considered significant. The numbers that matter are the ones that are round enough to be legible as milestones to an audience that processes quantity in round numbers, and the show's relationship with those milestones reveals something about how it understands its own duration and what that duration means. Numbers, in The Simpsons, are never just numbers. They are precise jokes that require specific knowledge to parse, evidence of mathematical education in an entertainment context that usually has no use for it, and occasionally real scientific work disguised as background decoration. The equations are correct. The statistics are accurate. The physics is real. The show built a room where mathematicians could feel at home, made sure it was in the background where nobody was supposed to look, and then left the lights on. Section 10. The Simpsons talking to itself. There is a specific kind of joke that The Simpsons makes that no other show in its era made with anything like the same frequency or sophistication. It is the joke where the show becomes aware that it is a show, where the characters acknowledge the existence of the audience, where the fiction briefly admits that it is fiction and then retreats back into it so quickly that you almost miss the acknowledgement. The simplest version is the character who turns to camera and delivers a line directly to the audience. This happens in The Simpsons more often than most viewers consciously register, partly because the show has trained its audience to expect that the characters are always facing each other and not the camera, and partly because many of the show's fourth wall breaks are very brief. A glance held a fraction of a second longer than normal, a line delivered with a slight tonal shift that acknowledges reception without naming it explicitly. Homer's direct address to the audience is the most frequent and the most varied. He looks at the camera in moments of exasperation, in moments of triumph, in moments where the absurdity of his situation is so complete that he appears to need external confirmation that it is happening. These moments are not consistent in their framing, which is itself significant. If Homer always broke the fourth wall in the same context, it would be a reliable joke device. Instead, his breaks are irregular, which makes each one feel spontaneous, like he's genuinely surprised to find himself in the situation the episode has put him in, and is checking with the audience as to whether this is really happening. The self-reference to the show's own production history is a more sophisticated form of the same gesture. When a character mentions that it has been a long time since something has been addressed, or when the show acknowledges a plot thread that has been dormant for several seasons, it is using the character's memory as a stand-in for the audience's memory, acknowledging the shared experience of having watched the show for a long time while technically staying within the fiction. These moments are Easter eggs for long-term viewers, recognitions that the show has noticed you've been paying attention and is choosing to reward that attention with a moment of shared acknowledgement. The episode where The Simpsons moves to a new house, and then by the end of the episode moves back, is a perfect structural example of the show using its own conventions as the subject of the joke. The entire episode is about the impossibility of the show changing its central setting, using the characters' desire for something new, and their inevitable return to the familiar, as a story that is also a commentary on the nature of long-running television and the resistance to change that keeps shows in familiar configurations regardless of where their characters would logically go after 20 seasons of development. The joke requires you to know that The Simpsons can never move, and it uses that knowledge to produce a story. The show's treatment of its own aging is one of its most sustained forms of self-reference. Various episodes have addressed the fact that the characters don't age, sometimes through the floating timeline mechanism, sometimes through dream sequences or flash forwards, and sometimes through characters appearing to notice their own temporal strangeness in ways they immediately dismiss or resolve by the end of the episode. These moments are Easter eggs about the show's most fundamental structural choice, the choice not to let time pass for the characters, embedded in episodes that are ostensibly about something else entirely. One of the most elaborate self-referential Easter egg sequences in the show's history is the collection of episodes that engage directly with the show's critical and cultural reputation. When The Simpsons makes jokes about people who think The Simpsons has gotten worse, or when it makes jokes about its own longevity and what that longevity means for the quality of the episodes being produced, it is incorporating its critics into its own text, making the critical reception of the show a subject within the show. This is a form of self-awareness that requires either tremendous confidence or a particular kind of creative desperation, and is probably in The Simpsons' case a combination of both. The episode Behind the Laughter is the show's most explicit engagement with this mode of self-reference. Structured as a VH1-style documentary about the real family behind the television show, it depicts The Simpsons as an actual family who agreed to have their lives adapted for television and then proceeded to become corrupted by fame and money and the pressures of the entertainment industry. The episode is a documentary about a fictional family and a satire of documentary conventions and a commentary on the nature of fame and celebrity, and a portrait of the specific pressures that a long-running television show creates in its creative relationships, all at the same time. Its self-reference is so complete that it briefly becomes unclear whether the show is inside or outside its own fiction, and that uncertainty is the episode's deepest Easter egg, the moment where the show most directly addresses its own strange existence as a cultural artifact that has outlasted most of the context that originally produced it. The show's engagement with fan culture, and specifically with the culture of close reading and theory that has developed around it, is another form of self-reference that has accumulated into a significant Easter egg sequence. When the show makes jokes about fans who overanalyze it, it is doing so in episodes that are themselves rich with material for analysis, which creates a recursive loop. The show is criticizing overanalysis in text that rewards overanalysis. It is telling you not to look too closely while giving you more to look at. This is provocation, the show daring you to look anyway and then hiding more things in the text you've been dared to analyze. The episode Bart Gets Famous contains a specific moment where Bart is advised that the key to maintaining a career in entertainment is finding one thing that works and doing it forever without variation, and the advice is delivered in a way that the show clearly knows is also advice being given to itself by the people who were, at that point, beginning to feel the creative strain of maintaining a show that had become a cultural institution. The comedy of the episode exists on the surface. The Easter egg exists in the subtext, which is the show examining its own situation through the fiction of a 10-year-old's brief career in catchphrase comedy. There's a meta Easter egg embedded in the show's relationship with its own catchphrases. Bart's various signature expressions and Homer's trademark exclamations became, in the early 90s, ubiquitous pieces of American cultural vocabulary. But the show, as early as its third or fourth season, began actively distancing itself from those phrases, using them sparingly and then using them self-consciously, with awareness that they had become external labels for the show rather than genuine expressions of the characters. The gradual retirement of the catchphrases from regular use and their occasional reappearance as meta-references to themselves is a very long Easter egg about the relationship between a show and the cultural shorthand that accumulates around it. The opening credits sequence itself also functions as a form of ongoing self-reference. The opening credits depict the family moving through their daily routines and arriving at the couch, which is a representation of what happens before every Simpsons episode. The credits are the show representing its own beginning. They are a ritual reenactment of the conditions that precede the fiction, which means that every time you watch the credits, you are watching the show's depiction of what it is like to be about to watch the show. This is a self-reference so fundamental that most viewers experience it without recognizing it as self-reference at all. The Simpsons talking to itself across 36 years has produced a text that is also a commentary on that text, a fiction that is also a meditation on the conditions of its own production, a comedy that is also a series of observations about the nature of comedy in the specific context of American primetime television in the specific historical period through which the show has been running. Every Easter egg embedded in the show's self-referential structure is, in some sense, the show saying, "We know what we are. We know what we've become. We know you've been watching. And we are still here, still watching back, still finding new ways to fold the awareness of being watched into the act of watching." The callbacks that only land for viewers who've seen hundreds of episodes, the jokes that require knowing the full history of a character who has had 15 minutes of screen time across 30 seasons, the visual gags that are built on top of visual gags from 20 years earlier, all of these are the show using the accumulated weight of its own past as a creative resource. The show has been running long enough that it can make jokes whose setup is 10 years old. It has been running long enough that returning to a moment from 15 seasons ago doesn't feel like nostalgia. It feels like visiting a place you know well and finding something you didn't notice before. The show has been talking to itself long enough that the conversation has become its own tradition, and the tradition is one of the things that keeps the show alive. Section 11. What Springfield looks like when nobody is watching. Springfield has a crowd problem that is also a treasure problem. The crowd of background characters that populates the town's streets, schools, churches, bars, and public spaces is, by the count of dedicated fans, one of the largest ensembles of recurring secondary characters in the history of American animation. Most of these characters have names. Many of them have partial backstories. A few of them have been the subject of their own episodes. And almost all of them are walking around in the background of every scene they appear in, carrying lives that the show has never had time to fully depict, but has never been willing to abandon either. The background residents of Springfield are one of the show's most distinctive and most under-discussed formal achievements. The decision to populate Springfield with a consistent, recognizable set of non-principal characters, to give those characters specific visual identities and occasional vocal identities, and to maintain those identities across hundreds of episodes over decades, created something unusual in the context of long-form animation. Springfield's crowd has memory. The crowd knows things. The crowd has relationships with the principal characters that the show acknowledges in the background of scenes, even when it has no time to address them in the foreground. The character known as the Sea Captain, Captain McAllister, is one of the most interesting examples of this phenomenon. He appears in Springfield in contexts that have nothing to do with seafaring, which is the fundamental joke of his existence, a maritime professional stranded in a landlocked community. But across his many background appearances, he has accumulated a life. He has a boat. He operates something that functions like a fishing vessel. He has opinions and relationships, and a particular way of moving through Springfield's social spaces that the show has built up through dozens of brief appearances without ever stopping to explain any of it. His presence in the background of a community meeting, or at the bar, or at a sporting event is always exactly right without being exactly explained. The twins Sherry and Terry, Lisa's classmates, are background characters who have appeared in hundreds of episodes and whose relationship with each other and with the main characters has developed through accumulated implication rather than explicit depiction. They are mean to Lisa in ways that are specific and recognizable across dozens of brief appearances. They have a social dynamic with each other that the show has never formally examined, but that is readable in how they move and speak in background positions in classroom scenes. They are a full relationship compressed into background animation, a complete portrait of elementary school social cruelty delivered entirely through positioning and expression rather than dialogue. The character known as Database, the bespectacled, nerdy classmate, appears in the background of Springfield elementary scenes with enough regularity to constitute a presence, but the show has never given him an episode or a substantial dialogue role. Database exists in Springfield the way most of Springfield's residents exist, as someone who was there before the main characters arrived and will continue to be there after the main characters have done whatever the episode requires of them. He is the background against which the foreground happens. His name, Database, is itself an Easter egg about the kind of character he is, a repository of information, a resource, someone whose function is to contain things rather than to do things. Otto Mann, the school bus driver, is a background character who has accumulated enough screen time across the series to qualify as a minor recurring player rather than a strict background figure, but his function in most episodes is precisely background. He drives the bus. He listens to music. He exists in a state of benign intoxication that the show treats as his permanent condition rather than as a situational state. The Easter egg in Otto's existence is the question of how the school district of Springfield has allowed someone in his demonstrably impaired condition to continue driving children for decades, a question that the show never asks because it has accepted Otto's situation as part of Springfield's baseline reality, which is itself the answer to the question. Springfield doesn't ask because Springfield has stopped noticing. The background has become the norm. The character fans typically call Crazy Old Man, whose name is occasionally given as Jasper, is another background figure whose presence accumulates meaning across episodes without any single episode being the key to understanding him. He is old. He has survived things. He has opinions that nobody asks for and that he delivers with the confidence of someone who has stopped caring whether his opinions are wanted. He appears in the background of events that have nothing to do with him, and he is always there in exactly the way that certain real community figures are always at every town event, regardless of whether the event has anything to do with their interests or lives. His consistency is the Easter egg. He is always there. He has always been there. He will continue to be there. Sideshow Mel, who replaced Sideshow Bob as Krusty's sidekick after Bob's first criminal conviction, is a background character who has a full performance persona, complete with a bone through his hair and a formal speaking style, and whose relationship with Krusty is depicted in dozens of background moments that suggest a professional dynamic very different from the Krusty-Bob relationship that preceded it. Mel is competent. Mel is loyal. Mel does his job without criminal ambition. And Mel is entirely overshadowed by the legacy of his predecessor, which is an Easter egg about the nature of being the person who follows someone extraordinary, the specific experience of competent adequacy in the wake of terrible brilliance. Mel has never tried to murder Bart Simpson. Mel has never run for office under false pretenses. Mel has simply done his job for decades, while everyone around him talks about his predecessor, and the dignity he maintains in that position is one of the show's quietest observations about what it means to be good at a job that nobody notices. Fat Tony and the Springfield mob exist in the background of Springfield's economy in ways that the show has occasionally made explicit but has more often left as implication. The mob's influence on Springfield's businesses, its presence at civic events, its relationships with the town's political and law enforcement establishment, are all Easter eggs that the show has planted in background details across dozens of episodes without ever fully accounting for the mob's role in Springfield's social fabric. When Fat Tony appears at a town event, his presence there is doing narrative work that the show almost never addresses directly, suggesting connections between Springfield's criminal underground and its civic life that are visible in who shares a table at what event. The Springfield elementary kids who are not Bart, Lisa, Nelson, Milhouse, or the other named characters form a population of background students that the show has maintained across decades of school scenes. These background students have consistent visual identities across many episodes and, for the dedicated viewer, develop recognizable personalities through accumulated small details. The boy who always sits in the back left of the classroom. The girl who appears to be friends with Sherry and Terry but whose loyalty is subtly questionable based on her positioning in various social configurations. The kid who always seems to be eating something in the background of classroom scenes in a way that raises questions about how he's getting away with it. The background lives of Springfield are the show's most patient Easter egg, the one that rewards years of accumulated viewing more than any single moment of revelation can. Every time you watch a Simpsons episode you've seen before, you're watching it with the accumulated knowledge of everything that came before, and the background characters carry that accumulation in ways the principal characters can't, because the principal characters are always in the story while the background characters are always just in Springfield, living their ongoing lives in the negative space of the narrative, waiting for someone to notice them. Every background character in a crowd scene is carrying a life that the show has never shown but has never denied. Springfield is as complete as any real town, partly because the show took the time to make its crowd recognizable, specific, and consistent. This means every scene set in a public space in Springfield contains dozens of Easter eggs in the form of faces whose full stories exist somewhere in the negative space of the show's narrative. The crowd is not decoration. The crowd is evidence that Springfield was built by people who cared about what happened in every room, in every building, even when the camera was somewhere else. People who wanted the town to be inhabited at every level of attention, not just the level that was paying enough attention to follow the story. Springfield, when nobody is watching, looks exactly like Springfield when the camera is on. The background is always consistent because the people who made it understood that consistency is what makes a place feel real. And a place that feels real is a place that people care about, and a place that people care about generates the kind of audience that pauses the frame to read the newspaper headline and comes back to episodes they've already seen just to check whether that background character is still there, still doing what they've always done, still living their life in the margins of a story that will always have more room in its corners than it has time to explore. Section 12. The final hidden layer. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have walked through its streets and read its signs and looked at its walls. We have listened to the names it gave things and watched the numbers that recurred in its margins. We have noted the faces in the crowd and the things written on the chalkboard and the details visible through the background windows of scenes that were supposedly about something happening in the foreground. Now we are at the final layer. The layer that is the most difficult to describe and the most important to understand, because it is not about any specific Easter egg but about the relationship between all of them, about what the accumulated weight of 36 years of hidden detail means for how we understand the show. The final hidden layer is the show's awareness of itself as a permanent text. In the early seasons, The Simpsons was primarily aware of itself as a television show, as a piece of weekly entertainment existing in the context of a particular moment in American culture. The Easter eggs from that period are largely contemporary references, observations about the specific world of the early 90s, jokes about figures and events and technologies that were current at the time of production and have since become historical. Something changed as the show continued. As it passed a decade, and then 2 decades, and then 3, as the writers realized that they were working on something that was no longer just a show but a cultural institution, the nature of the Easter eggs changed. The early Easter eggs were addressed to contemporary viewers. The later Easter eggs began to be addressed to future viewers, to the audience that would encounter the show not as a weekly broadcast but as an archive, as a body of work to be examined and excavated and researched the way scholars approach a historical text. This shift is one of the most interesting things about The Simpsons as a creative object. Most television shows are made for their present audience and do not anticipate a future audience capable of or interested in the kind of close reading that reveals their hidden layers. The Simpsons, somewhere in its second decade, began to be made for both. The show started leaving things for future viewers to find, started writing for an audience that would be watching with pause buttons and frame-by-frame capability, and the accumulated context that comes from years of scholarship and fan research. The Easter eggs planted in the show's later seasons are different in character from the ones planted in its early seasons. They are more patient. They expect more. They assume that the viewer who will find them has access to a much larger body of contextual knowledge than the original audience could have had, because that body of knowledge didn't exist yet when the first seasons aired. The later Easter eggs are written in a language that partly requires the earlier Easter eggs as a key. The show's relationship with its own writers is one of the final hidden layer's most interesting aspects. The Simpsons has employed hundreds of writers across its run, and many of those writers are themselves now cultural figures whose biographies and career trajectories are publicly known. A careful reading of the show, mapped against the known biographies of its writers, reveals a body of personal Easter eggs that are visible only to someone who knows which writer was working on which episode during which period and what was happening in that writer's life and career during that time. The show is, in this reading, also a series of personal letters written in disguise, using the characters and situations of Springfield as a code for the real-world experiences of the people who were writing it week by week across 3.5 decades. This is the most human layer of the show's Easter egg construction, and it is the one that requires the most interpretive generosity to engage with, because it asks you to see the Springfield world as a set of displacements for real experiences and real feelings that the writers were processing through the fiction of the show. Homer's fear of abandonment is a theme that appears in the work of specific writers during periods when those writers were, by their own account, in interviews and memoirs, experiencing fears of abandonment in their own lives. Lisa's sense of being the only person in her environment who cares about the things she cares about appears with particular intensity in episodes written by writers who have described similar feelings about their place in the television industry. The Springfield world is a projective surface, a place where the emotional reality of the people who built it is preserved in displacement, legible to those who know the code. The show's relationship with time, which is its deepest structural Easter egg, becomes visible only when you stand back far enough to see the whole thing. The characters don't age. The town doesn't change. The same problems recur with the same people in the same house on the same street. This has been described as a failure of the show, as laziness, as the consequence of commercial pressures that prevent narrative development. But there is another reading, and that reading is that the show's refusal to let time pass is its most deliberate formal choice, and the Easter egg hidden inside that choice is one of the most beautiful things about The Simpsons. The show knows it's set in amber. The characters are preserved, exactly as they were, in a moment that has been extended beyond any natural duration, and the show has, quietly, been making jokes about this for decades. The flash-forward episodes that imagine the characters as adults and then return them to their fixed ages. The moments where characters appear to notice their own stasis and then forget. The couch gags where alternate versions of the family arrive to find the regular versions already there. All of these are the show acknowledging what it's doing while continuing to do it, which is the deepest form of self-awareness available to a piece of art that exists within its own constraints. The show's engagement with death, which appears across its entire run in both comedic and genuinely sorrowful registers, is the final Hidden Layer's most profound subject. The Simpsons has lost people connected to it across its run, cast members and writers and crew and the various collaborators whose work made the show possible, and the show has consistently honored those losses in ways that are visible to the attentive viewer without being announced to the general audience. The specific moments where the show breaks its own comedic rhythm, where it allows genuine sadness to land without immediately converting it to a joke, are almost always connected, directly or indirectly, to real losses that the production was processing at the time. Doris, the cafeteria worker at Springfield Elementary, was voiced by Doris Grau, a script supervisor on the show who died in 1995. After her death, the character appeared in subsequent episodes without dialogue, present in the background of cafeteria scenes but no longer speaking. The character remained in Springfield without a voice, carrying the memory of the person who had given her one, visible in every cafeteria scene as a silent presence, a place held open. The show never explained this. The character was simply there and silent in the way that absence sometimes is. Edna Krabappel, Bart's teacher, was voiced by Marcia Wallace until Wallace's death in 2013. After Wallace died, the show retired the character with a chalkboard gag that read, "We will miss you, Mrs. K," in place of Bart's usual punishment sentence. The inversion of the chalkboard, which had been Bart's space for defiance and the writer's space for coded messages, into a space for direct, uncoded grief was the most visible emotional moment in the show's credits history. The show said something true in the space it usually used for comedy. The Easter egg was the sincerity. In a show that has been hiding things for 36 years, in a format that has been used for jokes since 1989, the most powerful hidden message was the one that wasn't hidden at all. The one that was right there, written in a child's handwriting on a green board, saying what it meant without saying it in any other way. The Simpsons is a show that loves its own world too much to leave it unexamined. The Easter eggs are evidence of that love. The show attending to Springfield with a care that goes well beyond the requirements of producing 22 minutes of comedy every week for decades. The show has been building something. It has been building it in the background of every episode, in the margins of every scene, in the credits of every production, in the names and numbers and signs and paintings and photographs and musical cues and linguistic choices that constitute the fabric of Springfield. What it has been building is a complete world. A world that is rich enough to reward any level of attention you choose to bring to it. A world that gives back more the closer you look. A world that has been tended with the specific kind of care that distinguishes a place someone loves from a place someone merely inhabits. Springfield is a place that has been loved for 36 years by hundreds of people whose names most viewers have never noticed, whose contributions exist in the margins of a show that most people watch with half their attention while doing something else. And the Easter eggs, the language in the background and the numbers in the margins and the faces in the crowd and the messages on the chalkboard are the evidence of that love, preserved in a medium designed for distraction and surviving there anyway because the people who hid them were betting that someone would eventually look. You looked. You are still here, which means you were the viewer the show was waiting for, the one paying close enough attention to find what was placed there for you. That's not a small thing. That's the whole point. The couch is right there. The family is assembled. The credits are done. And somewhere in the background, just past the edge of what the camera is showing you, something is written on a wall that you haven't found yet. You just have to keep looking. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. If you've made it this far, you know more about the hidden architecture of one of the most carefully constructed worlds in the history of American television than most people who have watched the show for decades. Drop a comment and tell me which Easter egg surprised you most. If there's a corner of Springfield you want to explore next, I would love to hear it. Take care of yourself. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. Expanded Notes. Section 1. Additional Linguistic Easter Eggs. The relationship between Homer's limited vocabulary and his extraordinary emotional expressiveness is one of the most linguistically interesting things about the show. Homer has fewer words available to him than almost any other adult character in Springfield, and yet his communication is rarely unclear. The show understands that emotional communication doesn't require sophisticated vocabulary. It requires precision of a different kind. Homer's language is precise in ways that formal language often isn't, because it operates through rhythm and emphasis and physical expression, rather than through the selection of the most accurate available word. When Homer says something is either the best or worst thing that has ever happened, he is speaking with perfect emotional accuracy even if the assessment is technically wrong. His language describes his experience rather than the world, and the experience is always described correctly. The show's use of technical vocabulary in contexts where technical vocabulary is unexpected is another form of linguistic Easter egg. When a character in a clearly comic context uses precise scientific or legal or financial terminology correctly, the show is creating a gap between the character's apparent competence level and their demonstrated knowledge that produces a specific kind of humor, the humor of unexpectedly encountering expertise in an unexpected place. Springfield is full of this kind of hidden competence. The character who seems to be a background joke turns out to know exactly what they're talking about. The vocabulary is precise and correct and invisible unless you happen to know the field well enough to recognize it. The show has consistently used food language as a specific register of emotional expression, and this is particularly true for Homer. The vocabulary Homer deploys when describing food, his enthusiasm for specific dishes, the precision with which he articulates his desire for particular flavors and textures, is the most linguistically sophisticated vocabulary he uses anywhere in the show. Homer's food language is richer and more specific than his emotional language, more accurate than his descriptions of human relationships, more carefully graduated than his assessments of his own experiences. This is a joke about priorities, but it is also a real observation about the way pleasure and language interact, about the way people become articulate in the domains they care most about, regardless of their general verbal facility. The episode titles across the show's run are themselves a sustained Easter egg sequence for viewers who know enough to decode them. Episode titles in The Simpsons have been puns on film titles, literary works, song titles, political slogans, historical phrases, and occasionally just English words deployed in ways that suggest multiple meanings simultaneously. The title Bart Gets an F puns on academic failure while also gesturing at the F word, which the show could not use in its dialogue but could invoke through a title that most viewers would read both ways simultaneously. The title Marge vs. The monorail takes the format of a legal brief and applies it to a situation that has nothing to do with law, which is itself a joke about the way American culture processes conflict through the idiom of litigation. The title Homer the Heretic is a joke that only fully lands if you know enough theology to understand what heresy actually means, which is to say it's a joke addressed to an audience that goes to church or has studied religion, which is a very specific audience to be targeting with a prime-time animated comedy. The sounds of Springfield are also a linguistic Easter egg in their own right. The show has been consistent about the sonic identity of Springfield in ways that go beyond the obvious. The specific way the school bell sounds at Springfield Elementary, the specific sonic texture of the Quickie Mart's door sensor, the noise the nuclear plant makes in background scenes. These are consistent sounds, maintained across decades of production, and they function as auditory anchors that signal location to the audience the way establishing shots do visually. The sound design of Springfield is a kind of second language, a system of auditory references that the show has been developing and maintaining since its earliest episodes, and that a long-term viewer will recognize immediately without being able to explain why. Expanded Notes Section 2. More on the chalkboard. The chalkboard's relationship with time is one of the most interesting things about it as a formal device. The chalkboard gag always takes place in the present, in the moment just before the episode begins, but the sentence Bart is writing is always a record of something that has already happened, a punishment for a prior event that the episode will never depict. This means the chalkboard exists in a specific temporal position relative to the episode's narrative. It is always slightly in the past relative to itself, always describing something that happened before the punishment began. The chalkboard is a record of history that precedes its own existence. This temporal structure is most interesting in episodes where the chalkboard gag and the episode's main narrative are in dialogue. When the chalkboard sentence describes something that is thematically related to the episode's central conflict, the relationship between the punishment and the story creates an implication about causality that the episode itself never makes explicit. It suggests that the episode we're about to watch is not an isolated incident but part of a longer pattern of behavior, a pattern that has been generating institutional responses that has a history in Springfield before this specific story begins. The chalkboard contextualizes the episode within a larger biography of Bart's troublemaking that extends backward into unshown time. The relationship between the chalkboard and Springfield Elementary as an institution is worth thinking about carefully. The detention represented by the chalkboard gag is a specific form of institutional response to specific behaviors, and the behaviors that generate the punishment are rarely ones that the institutional response is calibrated to address. Bart writes sentences on a chalkboard because he faked a seizure or appropriated a seeing eye dog. The writing of sentences is not going to prevent future seizure faking. It is not going to address whatever underlying behavioral dynamic produced the dog situation. The punishment is a ritual rather than an intervention, and the show is aware of this, and the Easter egg is in how consistently the punishments fail to match their stated purposes. Across the full run of the show's chalkboard gags, there is an implicit argument about the nature of institutional discipline that the show has never made explicit, but that is visible in the accumulation of sentences. What the chalkboard sequence is really saying, if you read it as a coherent text rather than a series of weekly jokes, is that behavioral correction through repetitive writing is a mechanism that produces compliance without producing change, that institutions use these mechanisms primarily to assert authority rather than to achieve the stated goal, and that the child who is most creative in finding new ways to get in trouble is, from a certain angle, the most alive person in the school. Bart's crimes are the evidence of his vitality. The punishment is the institution's way of managing that vitality without understanding it. The chalkboard gags have also functioned as a kind of ongoing social contract between the show and its long-term audience. The regularity of the format, the dependability of Bart at the board, the certainty that each week will begin with a sentence being written, is a form of ritual acknowledgement between the show and the viewer. The viewer knows what is coming. The show knows, the viewer knows. The sentence changes, but the ritual doesn't, and the ritual is itself a form of communication that says, "We are still here, we are still doing this, nothing fundamental has changed." For a show that has been running for 36 years, that ritual constancy is one of the deepest things it has to offer. Expanded Notes. Section 3. Couch Gag Expansions. The couch gag's relationship with the show's commercial structure is itself an Easter egg of sorts. The gag exists, in part, because of practical production realities, a flexible length element that could be shortened or extended as needed. But the show took this structural necessity and transformed it into one of its most creative spaces. This transformation is the Easter egg. The show took a requirement and made it a gift. took a time-filling device and made it a stage for genuine artistic experimentation, took a constraint and treated it as permission. The couch gags that have been most critically discussed are generally the ones that involved guest animators or that were obviously expensive and elaborate in their production. But some of the most interesting couch gags are the simple, early ones that did one small strange thing with the premise, and no more. A couch gag where the family arrives and the couch runs away. A couch gag where the family is already seated when Homer arrives and he has to watch from the doorway. A couch gag where the family arrives in the wrong order and they spend the entire sequence trying to rearrange themselves. These are jokes that operate by taking a simple premise very seriously, by asking what would happen if this one thing were different, and the simplicity of the disruption is what makes them work. The later, elaborate couch gags get discussed more often. The simple early ones are where the format's logic is most clearly visible. There is a meta-couch gag tradition within the show's couch gag history, which is the couch gag that is about having run out of ideas for couch gags. These appear with increasing frequency in the later seasons, and are either a sign of creative exhaustion or creative honesty, depending on how charitably you read them. But even the meta-couch gag is still a couch gag, still ends with the family on the couch, still fulfills the structural requirement of the format. The show can acknowledge that it has been doing this for a long time, and is running low on variations while simultaneously demonstrating, by the act of that acknowledgement, that it can still find something new to do with the space. The acknowledgement is the variation. The meta-couch gag is doing something new with the very constraint it's complaining about. The couch gag's relationship with dreams is one of the show's most interesting ongoing Easter eggs. Many couch gags have a specifically dreamlike quality, a logic that is coherent within the sequence but that doesn't connect to the world outside it, that begins without explanation and ends without resolution. The family runs toward the couch and something happens that doesn't follow from anything and doesn't lead to anything and exists purely in the few seconds of its own duration. This is the logic of the dream, and the show has been deploying that logic in the opening of each episode for 36 years, which means that every episode begins with something that feels slightly like waking up, like the transition between the dream state and the waking state, like the moment where you're not quite sure which side of consciousness you're on. The couch gag is the threshold between dreaming and watching, and the show has always understood this even if it has never said so directly. Expanded Notes Section 4. Deeper Name Analysis. The name of Springfield's most frequently referenced television program within the show, Krusty the Clown Show, is a name that functions as a description. The Krusty the Clown Show is not given a more evocative or specific title because it is a show that exists primarily as a delivery mechanism for commercial content aimed at children. It is called what it is. The name is the entire character of the enterprise. Krusty's show is Krusty's show, and nothing more. And the fact that this is apparently sufficient to sustain an enormous amount of cultural influence in Springfield is itself the joke. The name of the local television news program, Action News, is one of the show's most economical jokes. Action News was a real television news format philosophy developed in the 1970s that emphasized entertainment value and visual drama over substantive reporting, and the name Action News in The Simpsons is a compressed satire of that philosophy. Springfield's local news is called Action News because the name promises something the broadcast cannot deliver and that the audience doesn't require. The action is in the name. The news is mostly in the formatting. Professor Frink's name is a reference to John Frink, a writer on the show who shares the character's neurotic intellectual style, which makes the character a self-portrait rendered as a recurring joke. But the character's first name, John, and his various academic titles and credentials constitute a compressed portrait of a specific type of American intellectual, the kind who accumulates credentials and equipment as a substitute for the human connection that their extreme specialization has made difficult to achieve. Professor Frink is the most credentialed character in Springfield, and among the least socially integrated, which is the show making an observation about the relationship between expertise and belonging that it has never quite made explicit. Snake Jailbird's name is doing something specific with the criminal archetype in a way that most viewers accept as a simple joke. Snake is a name that signals criminality through the reptile association, the cold-blooded, the predatory, the creature that strikes without warning. Jailbird is a surname that is actually just a description of what Snake is, a person who has been in jail, specifically one of the birds that are associated with incarceration. Snake Jailbird is a man whose entire identity has been determined by his relationship with the criminal justice system, which is a fairly serious observation about the way American society treats incarcerated people, made in the form of a funny criminal character's name. The recurring character known as Disco Stew is a name that is a complete biography. Disco Stew's name contains his entire personality, his entire history, his entire tragedy. He is a man who is defined by a cultural movement that ended 4 decades ago. He is still Disco Stew in a world that has moved past disco. His name is both who he is and what happened to him, and the joke of his character is the joke of anyone who was formed by a specific cultural moment and found themselves carrying that formation into contexts where it no longer applies. Expanded Notes, Section 5. Background Story Details. The Springfield nuclear plant's exterior, as seen from the road approaching it, is one of the show's most carefully maintained background images. The plant appears in establishing shots, in scenes set outside the plant, and in the aerial views of Springfield that the show occasionally uses to orient the viewer geographically. Across all of these appearances, the plant's visual character is consistent in ways that accumulate into a portrait of industrial infrastructure that is aging, improperly maintained, and structurally compromised in ways that no single shot fully articulates, but that the accumulated images make unmistakably clear. The Easter egg in the plant's exterior is the picture of neglect that the background design team built over decades, without any single image being specific enough to serve as an indictment. The design of the Simpson house's interior reflects a specific material culture of a specific economic class in a specific historical moment. The furniture is not in bad shape, but is not new. The carpet pattern is one that would have been considered acceptable in the 1980s and has survived in the Simpson household primarily through inertia. The kitchen appliances are functional, but not current. The decorations are a mix of things that were deliberately chosen and things that simply accumulated. This is a portrait of a house that is maintained rather than updated, a house whose economic logic is sufficiency rather than aspiration. The background design team built a complete portrait of working-class material culture into the Simpson living room and kitchen, and that portrait is accurate enough to serve as a sociological document of the era in which the show was created. The school's cafeteria, visible in episodes set at Springfield Elementary, contains background detail about institutional food service that is consistently specific and consistently unflattering. The food visible in the background of cafeteria scenes is identifiable as specific institutional food types rather than as generic background decoration. There are dishes that are recognizable as real institutional food categories, rendered in the specific colors and textures that those foods actually have, rather than idealized versions. This level of visual specificity about something as unglamorous as school cafeteria food suggests a background design team that was either making a specific, satirical argument about institutional nutrition or was simply committed to accuracy at a level that went beyond what the show required. The library that appears in several episodes is drawn with a collection that, when examined closely, contains actual books. Not generic book shapes with indistinct spines, but books with visible titles that are real books. The selection visible in the library's background shelves is a curated collection that reflects a specific intellectual sensibility, one that includes works that a public library in a working-class American town might actually hold, but that also includes a few items that suggest either a more sophisticated collection policy or a background designer who slipped their own taste into the background design. Either way, the library is a real library in the sense that its collection is real, and that realness is an Easter egg for anyone who notices. Expanded Notes, Section 6. More credits content. The position of the showrunner's credit across different seasons of the show is a visible record of the show's complicated succession of creative leadership. The Simpsons has had many showrunners across its run, some of them transformative in their influence on the show's direction, others more continuity-maintaining, and the credits have recorded each transition. For viewers who read the credits carefully and who have followed the show across its full run, the showrunner credit is a document of the show's creative history, a succession of names that corresponds to periods that devoted fans can identify by sensibility and approach, even without knowing the specific dates. The credit is the Easter egg. The name is the clue. The clue tells you what era you're in. The thanks and acknowledgments that appear in the credits of certain special episodes, including the theatrical film and various anniversary productions, contain references to people and institutions whose connection to the show is not obvious from their names alone. Some of these acknowledgments are for clearances, for the rights to reference specific cultural materials that the episode uses. Some are for technical contributions that were unusual enough to require specific acknowledgement, and some appear to be genuine personal thanks, the production recognizing specific individuals for reasons that are not explained in the credit itself, but that presumably have a story behind them. These thanks are Easter eggs in the sense that they point to stories the credit doesn't tell, doorways to histories that the acknowledgement opens without fully entering. The international co-production credits that appear in some episodes are another documentary layer of the show's production history. The Simpsons, like most American animated programs of its era and later, used overseas animation studios for the actual production of the animation cells, and the credits reflect this production geography in ways that most American viewers have never thought about. The credits for overseas production are consistently present and consistently legible to anyone reading, a transparent acknowledgement of the global production system that creates one of the most quintessentially American shows in television history. This is not an Easter egg in the hidden sense, but it is hidden in the sense that most viewers never read it, which is a kind of hiding that doesn't require concealment. Expanded Notes, Section 7. More Celebrity Observations. The relationship between the show and its celebrity guests has changed in ways that mirror broader changes in the celebrity-media relationship over the decades. In the early and middle seasons, celebrity appearances in The Simpsons were understood as a sign that the show had cultural currency, that appearing in Springfield was something a major celebrity might want to do, because the show represented something about American culture that was worth being associated with. Later celebrity appearances, as the show's reputation for quality became complicated by its later season decline in critical estimation, involved celebrities whose relationship to the show's cultural position was different in character. A celebrity who appears in The Simpsons in 1993 is making a different kind of cultural statement than a celebrity who appears in the show in 2015. The 1993 appearance says the show is important enough to be worth my time. The 2015 appearance says one or more of several things. The show is still a cultural institution, even if not at its peak, or the show provides a specific kind of exposure that I want, or I have personal affection for the show from my childhood, or I had a free afternoon. All of these motivations are visible in the tonal difference between how early and late guest appearances are constructed, the degree of creative investment visible in the performance, the extent to which the celebrity seems genuinely engaged with the Springfield world versus simply delivering their lines. The Easter egg is the difference, and the difference tells you where you are in the show's cultural history. Expanded Notes Section 8. Treehouse Architecture. The architecture of the horror segments within Treehouse of Horror episodes follows specific rules that have been maintained across the show's run, with more fidelity than almost any other structural convention. Each segment has a setup period, a complication, and a horror reveal or escalation that resolves the setup. The resolution is never comforting. The horror of Treehouse of Horror is not resolved into safety. It resolves into a different kind of horror, into an ending that is either darkly funny or genuinely disturbing. And the distinction between those two modes of ending is itself an Easter egg about the show's tonal priorities. The endings of Treehouse of Horror segments fall into specific categories that have been mapped by fans. The ironic ending, where the characters survive but the victory is Pyrrhic. The escalation ending, where the horror that the segment has been building toward turns out to be only the beginning of something worse. The reversal ending, where the apparent monster is revealed to be a victim, and the apparent victim is revealed to be the real threat. The non-ending, where the segment simply stops, mid-horror, without resolution. Each category recurs across the Treehouse tradition, and a viewer who has seen enough of them can sometimes predict which category the current segment is heading toward, which produces a different kind of suspense than not knowing. The suspense of waiting to see exactly how the expected structure will be executed rather than what the structure will be. Expanded Notes. Section 9. Numbers and Patterns. The specific episode numbers that the show has treated as milestones reveal something about the production's sense of its own identity. Round numbers matter. The 100th episode, the 200th, the 300th. These were marked with specific attention, with episodes that either referenced the show's own history more explicitly than usual or that were formally distinctive in ways that signaled awareness of the milestone. The Easter egg in the milestone episodes is the form of the attention paid, whether the show chose to celebrate its history or to use the milestone as an opportunity for something formally experimental, which two things represent different theories of what an anniversary means in creative terms. The show has, across its run, produced several episodes that are formally structured around specific numerical concepts. Episodes built around countdowns, around the number 7, around binary logic, around the specific number that corresponds to the episode's production code in ways that are either coincidental or designed. Identifying which numerical structures are deliberate and which are accidents requires a level of production knowledge that most viewers don't have, which means the numerical Easter eggs are genuinely hidden even for viewers who would be looking for them. Expanded Notes. Section 10. Self-reference depths. The Simpsons has at various points made jokes about the process of making jokes, which is one of the more vertigo-inducing forms of self-reference available to a comedy. When a writer's room joke about how jokes get made finds its way into the actual episode, the joke is no longer just about the subject matter of the joke, but about the institutional process that produced it, and the viewer who catches this level is watching a different show from the viewer who doesn't. The meta joke and the object-level joke are both there simultaneously, available to whoever is looking for each one. The show's treatment of the joke that didn't land is another form of self-reference that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The Simpsons has, across its run, included jokes that are clearly audacious enough that the writers knew some portion of the audience would not respond to them, jokes that required specific knowledge or specific sensibilities to function as jokes rather than as confusing non sequiturs. These are Easter eggs in the sense that they are addressed to a specific subset of the audience. But they are also a statement about the show's relationship to consensus humor, its willingness to make the wrong joke for most of the audience in order to make exactly the right joke for a few of them. This is either artistic integrity or creative miscalculation depending on whether you're in the intended subset, and the show has consistently chosen to risk the miscalculation. Expanded Notes. Section 11. Springfield as Urban Document. Springfield is one of the most thoroughly documented fictional urban environments in American cultural history. The density of its depiction across hundreds of hours of animation has produced a city that, in its accumulated detail, begins to resemble an actual civic environment, with an actual civic history. Scholars of urban planning and American civic culture have occasionally used Springfield as a reference point for discussions of zoning, infrastructure, public space, and the design logic of American towns, not because Springfield is realistic, but because its consistency of detail makes it a coherent enough artifact to analyze. The show's depiction of Springfield's public spaces over time reveals an evolving understanding of what those spaces are for. Early Springfield public spaces are depicted as genuinely communal environments, places where the town's collective life happens, where civic decisions get made and civic conflicts get resolved. Later, Springfield public spaces are depicted as more fragmented, more contested, more likely to be the site of mob behavior or institutional failure than of genuine community function. This evolution mirrors changes in how Americans experience their own public spaces across the period the show has been running, and the background design choices that encode this evolution are an Easter egg about the show's engagement with real changes in American civic culture. The private spaces of Springfield, the houses other than The Simpsons, the interiors visible briefly through windows or in episodes that visit other homes, constitute a secondary map of the town's economic geography. The homes visible in the show are not uniformly middle class. There are homes that are clearly more expensive and homes that are clearly less so, distributed across Springfield in ways that reflect real urban economic geography. The Easter egg in these brief glimpses of private space is the economic map of Springfield that they collectively produce. A map that is never made explicit in the show's narrative, but that is visible in the accumulated background detail. Additional Section 1 material: dialect, idiom, and hidden speech patterns. The show's approach to dialect is worth examining at a level of detail that most viewers never reach. Springfield is meant to be a generic American locale, and the speech patterns of its residents are designed to be recognizable to Americans across regions without belonging clearly to any of them. This is a deliberate linguistic construction, a kind of composite American English that contains echoes of multiple regional dialects without committing to any of them. Homer's speech has traces of working-class Northern speech but also Southern speech and Midwestern speech, and an overall flatness of affect that belongs to no region specifically. He speaks American English the way a map of the country is American geography, showing everything without being any particular place. This composite dialect serves the show's geographic ambiguity, but it also creates some interesting opportunities for Easter eggs. When a character's speech briefly adopts a more specific regional marker, it's either a continuity error or an intentional signal. Burns's speech has, in various episodes, taken on specific registers that suggest specific periods of American linguistic history. His vocabulary occasionally pulls from early 20th century formal English in ways that would be consistent with his depicted age. When his language is most historically specific, it's also most revealingly biographical. The grammar of Burns's speech is an age hidden inside his dialogue, a linguistic fossil that contradicts the visual representation of a man who looks ancient in a cartoon way while speaking in a way that suggests a specific era of American life. Marge's speech is designed to be the most neutral in the family, and this neutrality is itself a portrait of character. Marge speaks in the register of someone who has worked very hard not to alienate anyone with the way she talks, who has suppressed whatever regional, class, or personal idiosyncrasies might have marked her original speech in favor of something that is broadly acceptable and inoffensive. This is exactly who Marge is. Her voice is her personality rendered as linguistic choice. The Easter egg is in the absence of distinctive features, the restraint of a character who is holding something back in every sentence she speaks, the smoothness of a surface that has been deliberately worked to remove the marks of whatever was originally there. Bart's speech is the most performative in the family, the most clearly constructed for effect, the most aware of its own reception. Bart talks in a way that expects to be heard, that calculates the response to his words before he delivers them. This makes his speech the most self-conscious in Springfield, which is interesting for a 10-year-old. And the show has been consistent about this quality across hundreds of episodes. Bart uses language as a tool in a way that the other family members don't. He selects his words for impact. He times his delivery. He understands that the way you say something is part of what you're saying. This makes him, in linguistic terms, the most sophisticated communicator in the family, which is not the obvious reading of a character whose primary language function is often to get in trouble for the things he says. Lisa's speech is the most earnest in the family, the most committed to meaning what she says and saying what she means, the least comfortable with the gap between language and intention that most human communication involves. Lisa speaks with the precision of someone who takes words seriously enough to be disappointed when the words don't produce the understanding she intended, and this precision is both her strength and the source of some of her greatest frustrations. The show has encoded Lisa's character into her speech in ways that are audible to anyone who pays close attention to the mechanics of her dialogue. She uses more qualifications than anyone else in the family, more acknowledgments of uncertainty, more explicit statement of reasoning, more careful distinctions between what she knows and what she believes. Her speech is the speech of someone who wants to be right, rather than just heard. The show's use of silence is a linguistic Easter egg of a specific kind. The moments when characters stop talking, when the usual verbal density of the show breaks into a pause that holds for a beat longer than comedy usually allows, are some of the most emotionally resonant moments in the series. The show understands that silence is a form of speech, that the absence of words in a context that expects words carries specific meaning, and it deploys silence with precision. These moments are Easter eggs because they require the viewer to have absorbed enough of the show's usual verbal texture to feel the weight of the departure. If you haven't watched enough of the show to know how much it usually talks, you can't fully register how significant it is when it stops. The show's treatment of foreign languages is a linguistic Easter egg tradition that runs across the entire series. Characters in the show speak languages other than English, with varying degrees of accuracy, and the degree of accuracy is itself significant. When a character speaks a language badly, it's usually played for comedy and the inaccuracy is the joke. When a character speaks a language well, the show is signaling that this person has a history with that language, a relationship to a culture or a life experience that the episode may or may not explore. Apu's English is accented but precise. the English of someone who learned it carefully as a second language and who has continued to develop his command of it through decades of use. His occasional errors are the errors of someone who knows the rules well enough to know when he's breaking them, which is a different kind of error from not knowing the rules at all. Additional Section 2 material. Chalkboard as cultural record. The chalkboard gags have, over 36 years, become an inadvertent cultural archive. Reading the chalkboard gags in chronological order is reading a record of what American television thought was worth commenting on in each year of the show's production, filtered through the specific sensibility of the writers who were working on the show during each period. The chalkboard gags from the early 90s read differently from the ones in the late 90s, which read differently from the ones in the 2000s, which read differently again from the ones in the 2010s and 2020s. This is not just because the cultural references change. It's because the sensibility of the writer's room changes, the priorities shift, the things that feel worth making a joke about shift with them. In the early seasons, the chalkboard gags tend toward the absurdist and the anarchic. They describe impossible or improbable things, events that could only happen in a universe where anything can happen and consequences are temporary. They have an energy that comes from a show that is still figuring out what it can do, and that is using the chalkboard space to test propositions. What happens if Bart has done something that no child has ever been punished for before? What does that punishment look like? The gags from this period are creative in the specific sense of making things that haven't existed before. In the middle seasons, the chalkboard gags become more culturally specific and more clearly targeted. They're responding to things that are happening in the world, to television shows and political events and cultural moments, with the swiftness that the chalkboard format allows. These gags are the most immediately topical in the show's history, the ones where the production used the chalkboard's short lead time to comment on things that were still in the news when the episode aired. They read as documents of specific cultural moments in a way that the early, more timeless gags don't. In the later seasons, the chalkboard gags become more self-referential, more likely to comment on the show itself or on the nature of the gag format, more comfortable with the kind of meta-humor that comes from being around long enough to have your own history to comment on. These gags are the most technically sophisticated in the show's history, in the sense that they require the most context to fully appreciate. They're addressed to an audience that has been watching for a long time, that has absorbed the chalkboard tradition deeply enough to appreciate variations on it, that has enough of the show's history and memory to feel the weight of a gag that references that history. Reading the chalkboard gags across all three of these periods is reading a kind of Bildungsroman of the show itself, the development of a sensibility across time, the accumulation of a voice and a history, and a set of things worth saying. The chalkboard is where the show's personality shows up most purely, unmediated by narrative requirements or character logic, just the sensibility of the writer's room expressing itself in a few seconds of Bart at a board. Additional Section 3 material. Couch gags, and the theory of animation. The couch gag has served, across the show's run, as a laboratory for animation technique in a way that has no equivalent in American primetime television. Because the couch gag exists outside the show's main animation conventions, it has been able to do things that the body of the episode cannot. Different frame rates, different aspect ratios, different color processes, different drawing styles. The couch gag has been the place where the production could experiment with animated form without risking the coherence of the main narrative's visual language. The decision to invite guest animators to produce couch gags was one of the most important creative decisions the show ever made for the form because it opened the couch gag to visual perspectives that were completely external to the show's own aesthetic development. The Simpsons has a very specific visual language, one that developed across the first two seasons and has been refined and extended since, but which operates within certain conventions that become invisible because of their consistency. When a guest animator brings their own visual language to the couch gag, the conventions become visible precisely because they're absent. The guest animator's couch gag is an Easter egg about the show's own aesthetic, a temporary departure that makes the normal visible by its contrast. The relationship between the couch gag and American animation history is a subject that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The couch gag has, in various episodes, engaged explicitly with the history of animation as a medium, its origins in silent film, its development through the theatrical cartoon era of the mid-20th century, its transition to television, and its eventual expansion into the digital forms that dominate animation today. These historical engagements are Easter eggs for animation scholars and enthusiasts, moments where the show steps back from its own present to acknowledge the tradition it's working within. They are the show recognizing that it exists in a lineage, that it has ancestors, that the thing it does every week in these opening seconds has a history that goes back to before anyone currently watching was born. Additional Section 4. Material. Name genealogies. The naming conventions for Springfield's criminal and underworld characters are worth their own examination. Snake Jailbird's name establishes a pattern in which Springfield's recurring criminals have names that are essentially job descriptions, names that leave no ambiguity about the social role the person occupies. Fat Tony is fat, and his name is Tony, and in the tradition of Italian-American gangster naming conventions, Tony is the name that corresponds to a specific kind of authority. The names of Springfield's criminals are the names of a specific cultural imagination of what criminals are like, an imagination formed through decades of American crime fiction and cinema, and the show is aware that it is drawing on that tradition even as it uses it. The naming of Springfield's peripheral institutions is an Easter egg tradition that extends beyond individual characters. The hospital, Springfield General, is a name that is so generic that it becomes a statement. There are hundreds of Springfield Generals in American medical history, and the choice of this most common of hospital names for Springfield's primary medical facility is a comment about what kind of medicine Springfield has access to. Not prestigious medicine, not specialized medicine, general medicine, from a general hospital, for the general population of a general American town. The name communicates an entire healthcare system's relationship to its patients. The naming of the streets in Springfield, which appear briefly in various episodes as characters drive or walk through them, follows a pattern that has been identified by fans who have tried to assemble a complete Springfield street map from background visual evidence. The street names in Springfield tend toward the aspirational and the generic in ways that suggest a planned suburb from a specific historical period. Evergreen Terrace is an aspirational name, but there are also streets in Springfield with names that are darker, more utilitarian, more honest about what the neighborhood is like. The contrast between aspirational street names and the actual conditions of the streets they name is a background Easter egg about the gap between American suburban rhetoric and American suburban reality that the show has been developing since its earliest seasons. Additional Section 5 material. What the camera misses. There is a specific visual Easter egg tradition in The Simpsons that has to do with what happens just outside the frame. The show has, on multiple occasions, structured scenes so that something significant is visible just at the edge of what the camera is showing. Something that would be missed by a viewer whose eye is following the action in the center of the frame, but that becomes visible when you look at the edges. This is a visual version of the background text Easter egg, a piece of content that is technically there, but that requires active visual searching to find. The edges of Springfield's streets, visible in wide shots of the town, contain storefronts and signage that the camera never approaches closely enough to read at normal viewing speed, but that are legible at a pause. These edge-of-frame storefronts have been cataloged by fans, and the result is a retail directory of Springfield that extends far beyond the businesses that the show has ever depicted as significant. There are stores in the background of Springfield's wide shots that appear in no episode, that have never served as a setting for any story, that exist only as background detail in establishing shots, and that nonetheless have names and visual identities that suggest complete fictional entities behind the glass. The visual grammar of the show has always included an awareness of space that extends beyond the immediate scene. When a camera is set up in a room for a conversation between two characters, the room extends in all directions beyond what the frame shows. The show's background design team has consistently populated those extensions, the walls behind the characters, the rooms visible through doorways, the views out of windows, with detail that is consistent with the established visual identity of the space, even when the camera will never move to show it directly. This is detail made for no viewer in particular, detail that exists because the people making the show believed that Springfield should be coherent even in the places nobody looks. Additional Section 12 material. The show's relationship with its own ending. The Simpsons has been ending for 30 years. Or rather, the show has been in conversations about ending for 30 years, producing periodic announcements and negotiations about whether it will continue and for how long, while continuing to continue. This ongoing not ending is itself one of the show's most significant Easter eggs about the nature of American popular culture and its relationship with the things it loves. The show has imagined its own ending multiple times, in flash-forward episodes, in speculative sequences, in couch gags that depict futures where the show has stopped and the family has aged, and Springfield has changed. Each of these imagined endings is a rehearsal for a real ending that has not yet arrived, and the accumulation of these rehearsals is a document of the show's relationship with its own mortality, a document that is both funny and genuinely moving if you read it as such. The emotional logic of a show that has been running for 36 years and that has depicted its own characters as eternal, unchanging, incapable of aging or dying in any permanent way, is the emotional logic of denial. Not the dishonest denial of something known to be true, but the specific kind of willed suspension of acknowledgement that allows you to continue doing something you love without being overwhelmed by the awareness that it will eventually stop. The show's refusal to let its characters age is a form of love, a form of holding on, a form of insisting that the thing you value most in the world should not be subject to the same laws of time and loss that govern everything else. This is why the moments when the show breaks this refusal, when it allows genuine loss to appear and be acknowledged, are the show's most powerful moments. The death of Maud Flanders, the death of Homer's mother, the retirement of Sideshow Bob to a life of relative peace. These are moments when the show's denial was overcome by something larger than itself, when the weight of the story required acknowledging what the form was working to suppress. And these moments are devastating precisely because of what surrounds them, precisely because they occur in a context of eternal stasis, of characters who are always the same age, and always in the same house, and always waiting for the same story to begin again. The final hidden layer of The Simpsons is not a single Easter egg, but the accumulated understanding that the show has been about this all along, about the desire to hold on to the things you love, about the way that love expresses itself in attention, in the act of noticing and recording and hiding and preserving, about what it means to care enough about a world you've made to fill it with things that nobody will notice unless they look very, very carefully. You are looking carefully. That's why you're still here. That's the whole point of everything that's been hidden, the hope that someone would care enough to look. Springfield will be here when you come back. The chalkboard will have a new sentence. The couch will have a new gag. The background will have a new sign just past the edge of the frame. And somewhere in all of it, something will be waiting that has been waiting since the day it was placed there, patient as a message in a bottle, hoping for the right reader on the right shore. Rest now. The show will still be running. It always is. Further explorations, the music of Springfield. Springfield has a musical life that operates below the threshold of most casual viewers' attention, but that constitutes one of the show's most carefully maintained background Easter eggs. The music that plays in scenes where no character is consciously listening to it, the incidental music that scores transitions and mood shifts and comedic beats, has been composed and arranged with a level of precision that goes far beyond what the function requires. The show's composer, Alf Clausen, worked on the series for decades and developed a specific musical language for Springfield that is distinct from any other animated series. The music for The Simpsons doesn't simply underscore the emotions of scenes, it comments on them. When a scene is sad, the music might make it slightly sadder, or it might introduce a note of irony that reframes the sadness, or it might seem to be playing the wrong emotion entirely, and then resolve in a way that proves to have been right all along. This is compositional intelligence of a high order, and it's happening in the background of every scene while most of the audience is reading the subtitles or folding laundry. The musical Easter eggs in the show include moments where the incidental score quotes specific pieces of music in ways that comment on the scene. A moment of Homer's domestic contentment underscored by a brief quotation from a piece of music associated with a very different kind of contentment. A scene of civic corruption underscored by a musical quotation from a tradition of ceremonial dignity that the scene is explicitly violating. These quotations are audible only to viewers who know the source material well enough to recognize the quote, and they add a layer of meaning to the scene that is completely invisible to anyone who doesn't. The diegetic music in the show, the music that the characters themselves hear and respond to, is also a layer of Easter eggs. When a character turns on a radio or puts on a record or starts singing, the specific song they choose is always the right song for the character in that moment, in a way that goes beyond coincidence. Marge's musical choices reflect her personality. Lisa's musical choices reflect her aspirations. Homer's musical choices reveal something about him that his normal behavior conceals. The show has been using music as a character revelation device throughout its run, and the specific pieces chosen for these moments of diegetic music are Easter eggs about the characters that the episodes themselves often don't have time to make explicit. The Springfield musical episodes are a specific subset of the show's music Easter egg tradition. When The Simpsons does a musical episode, which it has done several times across its run, the musical forms it adopts are not chosen randomly. They're chosen for their relationship to the episode's subject, with an awareness of the history of musical theater and its use of specific forms to express specific kinds of content. A Gilbert and Sullivan parody is chosen when the subject matter calls for the specific combination of formal propriety and hidden subversiveness that Gilbert and Sullivan specialized in. A gospel format is chosen when the content involves community and transcendence and the specific emotional register of collective belief. These choices are Easter eggs about the history of musical theater, about the specific emotional contracts that different musical traditions have established with their audiences, about what it means to choose a particular form as the container for a particular story. Further explorations. Springfield's relationship with history. The Simpsons has engaged with American history throughout its run in ways that constitute a sustained Easter egg about the relationship between the present and the past. Springfield is a town that has a history, and that history has been sketched in dozens of flashback episodes, historical reimaginings, and background references that collectively constitute a partial chronicle of Springfield across time. The frontier Springfield visible in flashback episodes has a specific visual identity that draws on the iconography of American frontier mythology while also subtly undermining it. The founding residents of Springfield are not heroic pioneers in the conventional sense. They are recognizable ancestors of the current Springfield residents, carrying the same character flaws and institutional tendencies in period-appropriate costumes. The Easter egg in the historical Springfield episodes is the suggestion that the things wrong with the current Springfield were always wrong with it, that the town's flaws are not the result of decline from an earlier excellence, but are continuous with the founding character of the place. The Springfield of the 1950s, visible in several episodes that flash back to Homer's parents' era, is one of the show's most carefully constructed historical environments. The visual language of that period, the specific colors and textures and design sensibilities of post-war American domestic life, is rendered accurately enough to function as historical documentation even while being filtered through the show's consistent visual style. The 1950s Springfield episodes are Easter eggs for anyone who knows enough about the material culture of that period to recognize how accurately the background design team has rendered it. The relationship between Springfield's history and the show's floating timeline creates specific Easter eggs about how the past is being reconstructed. If the show is set in the eternal present, then its flashbacks to the past are not fixed in relation to any particular year. They float too, positioned relative to the present rather than in absolute historical time. This means the show's depictions of the Simpson family history have shifted as the floating present moved forward, the same events being set in different decades depending on when the episode depicting them was produced. The history of Springfield is a living history, in the sense that it keeps being rewritten to maintain its relationship with a present that never stops moving. Further explorations the show's relationship with class. The Simpsons is one of the most sophisticated, sustained treatments of social class in American popular culture, and this sophistication is largely delivered through the kind of background detail and coded language that constitutes the show's Easter egg tradition. Homer's relationship with his economic position is one of the most carefully observed things in the show. He is aware, in a way that the show rarely makes explicit, of the gap between the life he has and the life that American culture tells him he should have. This awareness doesn't make him miserable in any sustained way, because Homer's psychology is not organized around sustained awareness of anything, but it surfaces in specific moments as a kind of recognition that is quickly suppressed. These moments are among the show's most honest observations about working-class consciousness and they're Easter eggs for viewers who are attentive to the specific ways that Homer's usual cheerful obliviousness breaks down. The economic geography of Springfield, with its wealthy neighborhoods and its declining ones, its successful businesses and its failing ones, its people who have too much and its people who don't have enough, is rendered in background detail throughout the show's run. The visual difference between the Springfield that Burns inhabits and the Springfield that Homer inhabits is consistent and specific and unmistakable, and it constitutes one of the show's most persistent Easter eggs about the material reality of American class divisions. The show never needs to say that Burns and Homer live in different worlds. It shows you the two worlds in enough background detail that the difference is self-evident. The show's treatment of aspiration and disappointment is one of its most sustained class Easter eggs. The characters in Springfield consistently want things that the show gently suggests they are not likely to get, and the specific form of those wants reflects the class position of the wanter. What Homer wants is different from what Lisa wants is different from what Burns wants, and the differences are not just personal but structural. Each character's aspiration is calibrated to their position, shaped by what their position allows them to imagine wanting, constrained by what their experience tells them is actually possible. The Easter egg in this is the coherence of the class imagination, the way the show has consistently rendered not just economic positions but the subjective experience of those positions, the specific shape that hope and disappointment take when they're filtered through a particular relationship with material reality. Further explorations? The show's future and its past. There is a specific quality to the experience of watching The Simpsons now that is different from the experience of watching it at any earlier point in its history, and that quality is the weight of accumulated context. Every episode you watch now is watched in the presence of all the episodes that came before it, and that presence is not passive. It actively shapes what you're watching, enriches certain moments, complicates others, makes some things funnier and some things sadder than they would be in isolation. This accumulated weight is itself a kind of Easter egg, one that exists only in the viewer and not in any specific moment of the show. It is the Easter egg of having watched something long enough to have a relationship with it, the specific knowledge that comes from sustained attention, the particular sensitivity to the show's rhythms and patterns and recurring concerns that develops over years of watching. The viewer who has seen 500 episodes of The Simpsons is not watching the same show as the viewer who has seen 5. They are watching the same frames and hearing the same dialogue, but they are watching different shows because they are bringing different histories to the viewing. The show has always understood this, has always been aware that its long-term viewers are watching a different show from its casual viewers, and has designed its Easter eggs accordingly. The hidden content in the show is addressed to the long-term viewer, the one who cares enough to look carefully, who has enough context to understand references that require context, who has been paying enough attention to notice departures from the norm. This is a relationship of mutual recognition between a show and its most devoted audience, and the Easter eggs are the show's way of acknowledging that relationship. The Simpsons has been running for as long as most of its current viewers have been alive. For many people, the show has been a constant across their entire conscious experience of the world, a presence in their lives that has outlasted most relationships and many institutions. For those viewers, watching the show is not just watching a show. It is engaging with a presence that has been there through their education, their formative experiences, their adult life, their relationship with American culture across the period in which their own culture was formed. The show is not just content, it is context. It is part of the lens through which certain people see certain things. The Easter eggs embedded in the show are part of what has made this possible. They have given the show a depth that repays continued attention, a richness that makes returning to old episodes rewarding rather than simply nostalgic, a sense that there is always more to find if you keep looking. This depth is what makes The Simpsons something other than entertainment, what makes it the kind of cultural artifact that people care about with an intensity disproportionate to its status as a cartoon, what makes the question of its quality and its future and its legacy something that people argue about with genuine passion. The show is 36 years old. The chalkboard is still there. The couch is still there. The names are still doing what they've always done. The numbers are still in the background, waiting to be checked. And somewhere in a scene you've already watched, there is something you haven't found yet. You now know enough to go looking. Further explorations. What Springfield says about America. The Simpsons has, across its entire run, been one long argument about what America is. Not what it claims to be, not what it aspires to be, but what it actually is when you look at it from the perspective of the living room of a yellow family on a street called Evergreen Terrace in a town that refuses to be located anywhere in particular. This argument is conducted primarily through Easter eggs. The show's explicit content, the plots and the dialogue and the jokes that land in the first pass of viewing, is more general in its commentary. But the background detail, the names of things, the signs in windows, the equations on blackboards, the ways that specific scenes reference specific histories and traditions and cultural moments, these are where the show's deepest arguments about America are made. They are made quietly, in the margins, in a form that requires effort to access, which is itself a comment about the kind of country that rewards attention and what kind it doesn't. Springfield is America in miniature in the specific sense that it contains all of America's contradictions at a manageable scale. The extreme wealth of Burns and the precarious working-class existence of Homer exist in the same town, go to the same convenience store, watch the same local news. The corruption of the police force and the genuine civic spirit of the town meeting coexist in the same institutional landscape. The anti-intellectualism of the mob and the genuine brilliance of the show's smartest characters inhabit the same schools, the same neighborhoods, the same bars. The contradictions don't resolve. They persist. They are Springfield, and they are America, and the show has been patient enough to sit with them for 36 years without insisting on a resolution. The show's approach to American politics is one of its most consistently interesting Easter egg traditions. The show does not take political sides in any obvious way. Its satire falls on liberals and conservatives, on Democrats and Republicans, on all varieties of American political identity, with roughly equal affection and roughly equal mockery. But the Easter eggs in the political material are not even-handed in the same way. They tend to be more pointed, more specific, more willing to identify specific sources of American dysfunction in ways that the more even-handed surface comedy doesn't. The equation is in the background. The explicit joke is in the foreground. The background is where the show's actual convictions reside. The show's treatment of American religion is another dimension of this Easter egg tradition. The Simpsons has a complicated relationship with religious faith in general, and with American Christianity in particular, expressed through the First Church of Springfield and its parade of increasingly hapless religious leaders and its congregation of genuine believers mixed with people who are there for social reasons. The explicit treatment of religion in the show is generally affectionate and generally comic, avoiding explicit theological critique in favor of observation. But the background treatment is more pointed. The things visible in the background of church scenes, the notices on the church bulletin board, the specific language of the signage, are where the show's actual observations about American religious life are most visible. The relationship between Springfield's civic institutions and the citizens they serve is one of the show's most sustained background Easter eggs. The institutions are failing. The school is underfunded and poorly led. The police force is incompetent and occasionally corrupt. The hospital provides care that is as likely to harm as to help. The municipal government is captured by whatever powerful interest is currently applying the most pressure. These institutional failures are depicted in the foreground as comedy and in the background as documentation. And the background documentation is more systematic and more specific than the foreground comedy, which is limited by the needs of the joke. The Easter egg tradition of the show is where the institutional critique is most fully developed. Further explorations. The hidden architecture of the jokes in The Simpsons have an architecture that is worth understanding because the architecture is itself an Easter egg about the show's theory of comedy. The most basic Simpsons joke has three components: a setup, a reversal, and an implication. The setup establishes an expectation. The reversal violates the expectation in a specific way, and the implication extends the reversal into a conclusion that is more interesting than the reversal itself. Most television comedy operates with setup and reversal and stops there. The Simpsons almost always adds the implication, the additional move that takes the joke somewhere beyond the punchline. It is this implication that most distinguishes the show's comedy from the comedies that surrounded it. And it is this implication that makes the show's jokes rewarding on multiple viewings in ways that simpler comedy doesn't offer. The Easter egg hidden in this architecture is the suggestion that the implication, the move that takes the joke somewhere beyond the punchline, is always available if you know to look for it. There is an implication to every joke the show has ever made. Sometimes the implication is funny. Sometimes the implication is serious. Sometimes the implication is the joke's actual subject, which the surface humor was designed to approach indirectly. Following the implication past the punchline is what distinguishes the close viewer from the casual viewer, and it's what the show has always been rewarding in its best material. This architectural principle extends to entire episodes, where the episode's apparent subject, the thing that gets described in a TV guide summary, is often not the episode's actual subject. The episode that is apparently about Homer getting a new job is actually about Homer's relationship with authority and his complicated feelings about being needed. The episode that is apparently about Bart's prank is actually about the difference between cruelty and mischief and the line between them. The episode that is apparently about Lisa's academic success is actually about what success costs and who pays. The apparent subjects are the setup. The actual subjects are the implication. And the implication is always there, always richer than the summary suggests, always accessible to the viewer who is willing to follow the joke past the punchline. Further explorations, the actors and their hidden performances. The voice acting in The Simpsons contains Easter eggs of a specific kind that are entirely auditory and that require deep familiarity with the show to catch. The voice actors for the principal characters have spent decades developing their performances, and within the consistency that gives the show its familiar sound, there is an enormous range of variation that the actors use to convey nuance that the animation cannot fully render. Dan Castellaneta's performance as Homer across 36 years contains variations that document Homer's emotional development in ways that are invisible until you become attentive to them. There are episodes where Homer sounds subtly different, where the fundamental vocal character is intact but something in the delivery has shifted in a way that signals something specific about the episode's emotional territory. These are acting choices, deliberate variations from the established performance, and they are Easter eggs for the viewer who has heard enough of the show to notice departure from the norm. The moments when voice actors break slightly from their established characters, when a performance contains a microsecond of something unexpected, are among the show's most interesting auditory details. These are not accidents. They are choices, moments where an actor brought something personal to a performance, where the line between the character's emotion and the performer's emotion became thin. These moments are not visible in the animation. They are only audible if you're listening with the kind of attention that most viewers reserve for the visual channel. The Easter egg is in the voice. Further explorations, what has never been said out loud. The Simpsons has, across 36 years, accumulated a body of things that it has never quite said directly, things that the show's pattern of behavior implies, that the accumulated evidence of the Easter egg suggests, that the background detail confirms, but that no episode has ever stated as a conclusion in its main narrative. The show has never said that Springfield is a metaphor for America, though it clearly is. It has never said that Burns represents unchecked capital, though he clearly does. It has never said that Homer's limitations are imposed rather than inherent, though the evidence suggests this. It has never said that Lisa's isolation is the result of structural factors rather than personal failure, though the background materials make the case. The show has been making these arguments for 36 years in the margins, in the background, in the names and numbers and hidden text, while maintaining a surface level of comedy that keeps the arguments from becoming didactic. This is the final Easter egg. The show has been saying something specific and important about American life for 36 years, and it has been saying it in a way that maintains total deniability, that never requires the show to defend its politics because its politics are always in the background, always in the language of joke rather than assertion, always available to be read but never forced on anyone who is only there for the comedy. The Simpsons is a comedy about a family and also an argument about a country, and the argument is in the Easter eggs, and the Easter eggs are everywhere, and they have been waiting for you since the very first episode, patient as equations on a blackboard, legible to anyone who knows what to look for, invisible to anyone who doesn't. Now you know what to look for. Go to sleep. The show will still be running when you wake up. It always is. Further explorations, recurring visual motifs, and what they mean. The Simpsons has developed a vocabulary of recurring visual motifs that function as Easter eggs for attentive viewers. These are images that recur across episodes with enough frequency that they begin to feel significant, that accumulate meaning through repetition, that eventually constitute a visual language within the show's language. The image of Homer standing outside the Quickie Mart at night is one of the show's most recurring compositions. It appears in episodes that are about very different things, and its repetition suggests that it means something beyond the immediate plot context. Homer, outside a convenience store, at night, alone. The image is never discussed. It's never made explicit. But across dozens of appearances, it begins to accumulate a specific emotional weight, the weight of a man who is often outside the places he should be inside, who finds himself in transitional spaces between the destinations his life has assigned him, who is neither fully at work nor fully at home but somewhere in the between, that convenience stores specialize in serving. The image of Lisa at her window is another recurring visual Easter egg. Lisa, at the window of her room or the living room, looking out at the street or the yard, is a composition that appears whenever the episode needs to communicate something about her internal state without having her articulate it. The window is a threshold she is not crossing. She is inside looking out, which is her fundamental condition in Springfield. A person who can see the world she wants to be part of but who is separated from it by the glass of her circumstances. The window composition is the show's shorthand for Lisa's situation, a single image that contains her whole relationship with the place she lives and the life she's been given. The image of Homer in the corner of a room, having retreated from a conversation or a confrontation, is a recurring composition that the show uses when Homer's usual strategy of forward momentum has failed him and he needs a moment of strategic retreat. This composition appears across hundreds of episodes, with enough consistency that it functions as a specific emotional note in the show's visual vocabulary, the note of Homer biding his time, of Homer having temporarily withdrawn from the field without conceding defeat. It is a portrait of a specific kind of masculine emotional management, the retreat to a corner as a way of managing a situation that can't be managed more directly, and the show has been making this portrait in the margins of its episodes since the very beginning. The recurring image of the Simpson family as a unit, gathered together in the living room, or at the dinner table, or on the couch, arranged in a specific configuration with Homer at the center, and Marge beside him and the three children distributed around them, is both the most familiar image in the show's visual vocabulary and the most meaningful. This image is what the show is about. Not any particular episode, not any specific storyline, not any of the theories or mysteries or Easter eggs, but this. A family together in a room, imperfect and difficult, and absolutely committed to being in the same room. The image recurs because the show keeps returning to its essential subject, the thing underneath all the comedy and the cultural commentary and the hidden mathematical equations. A family, a room, the specific gravity that keeps certain people orbiting each other even when the orbit is chaotic. Further explorations the show's relationship with failure. The Simpsons has a sustained meditation on failure that runs through its entire history, and that constitutes one of the show's most important and least discussed thematic Easter eggs. The show is full of failure. Homer fails constantly, spectacularly, and without apparent consequence. Burns fails occasionally, and the failures are more devastating for being rare. Lisa fails in specific ways that are more painful than Homer's failures because they mean more to her. Ned succeeds constantly and finds no comfort in the success. The failures and the successes in Springfield are distributed in ways that don't reward, merit, or punish incompetence in any consistent way, which is one of the show's most honest observations about actual human experience. The specific way each character fails is a portrait of their character. Homer's failures are the failures of enthusiasm and impulsiveness, of someone who commits fully and is frequently wrong about what he's committing to. Burns's failures are the failures of disconnection, of someone who has been so insulated from ordinary human experience that he has lost the ability to predict how humans will respond to his actions. Lisa's failures are the failures of idealism, of someone whose standards are calibrated to a world that doesn't exist yet. Bart's failures are strategic, the failures of someone who understands the risks and takes them anyway because the risk is part of the point. Marge's failures are the failures of accommodation, of someone whose strengths lie in maintaining stability in circumstances that are not stable, and who struggles when the circumstances require a different response. These failure profiles are Easter eggs about character in the deep sense, not character traits but character structure, the specific shapes of a person's weaknesses as determined by the specific shapes of their strengths. The show has been developing these profiles since its earliest seasons and has maintained them with remarkable consistency, which is why the failures feel specific and recognizable rather than generic. Homer's failure is Homer's failure and nobody else's. Lisa's failure is Lisa's failure and nobody else's. The specificity is the Easter egg. The show's refusal to let failure be permanent is another dimension of this meditation. Homer fails and recovers. Bart fails and is forgiven. Lisa fails and recalibrates. The failures don't compound into tragedy the way they would in a more realistic narrative. They are absorbed by the resilience of the characters and the structural forgiving of the show's reset mechanism. This is the show's deepest comfort and its deepest lie, simultaneously. The comfort is that failure is survivable. The lie is that failure is without consequence. The Easter egg is in the tension between those two things, in the show's awareness that it is offering a fantasy of resilience while also documenting the specific realities that make resilience necessary. Further explorations, the sound design, and what it hides. The sound design of The Simpsons is a largely overlooked layer of the show's Easter egg tradition, partly because audio Easter eggs are harder to catch than visual ones, and partly because the show's visual richness tends to absorb most of the analytical attention it receives. But the sound of Springfield is as carefully constructed as its appearance, and it contains hidden material of its own. The ambient sounds of different Springfield locations have been developed and maintained across the show's run, with a consistency that matches the visual consistency of the background design. Moe's Tavern has a specific ambient sound that includes the hum of refrigeration equipment and the low murmur of other conversations, and the specific acoustics of a room that has been absorbing noise for decades without ever being refurbished. This is not generic bar ambience. It is specifically Moe's ambience, audibly different from any other bar that might appear in any other context, and a viewer who had spent enough time in Moe's Tavern over the course of many episodes would recognize the room by its sound before the image established the location. The show has used sound design to encode information about the emotional state of scenes in ways that go beyond the conventional functions of incidental music. There are scenes where the ambient sound of a space becomes unusual in ways that signal something wrong before the image or dialogue confirms it. A room that is slightly too quiet, or slightly too loud, or that contains a specific sound that doesn't quite fit the location, is often a scene where something is about to change or reveal itself, and a viewer attuned to the show's sound grammar might catch the signal before the visual grammar confirms it. The music that plays from background radios and televisions is another layer of auditory Easter eggs. When a radio in the background of a scene is playing something specific, the song is always chosen for a reason, whether that reason is thematic connection to the scene, ironic contrast with the scene, or reference to something outside the scene that the song evokes. The background radio is one of the show's most compact Easter egg formats, a single song choice that can do substantial narrative or commentary work without ever becoming the focus of the scene. Further explorations, what the show knows about television. The Simpsons knows more about television than almost any other television show ever made, and it demonstrates that knowledge continuously through the Easter eggs embedded in its own structure and its treatment of television as a subject within the show. The show has been a meditation on television as a medium from its very beginning, a family that watches television as a central activity, a show that includes a show within a show as a recurring element, a narrative structure that borrows from and comments on virtually every genre that primetime American television has produced. The Simpsons is a television show about watching television, and it is aware of this, and it uses this awareness as the basis for a sustained Easter egg tradition that extends from specific episode references to formal choices about how to construct a scene to deeper arguments about what television is and does. The show's knowledge of television history is visible in its references to specific programs and genres and eras of American broadcasting. There are episodes that reference the specific visual grammar of 1970s American network television, with its particular color processing and camera positioning and sound design, rendered accurately enough to serve as historical documentation. There are episodes that reference the specific conventions of game shows and talk shows and news programs and procedural dramas with enough precision that the references function as criticism as well as comedy. The show understands what it's referencing well enough to understand what's wrong with it, and the Easter eggs in these references are the show's assessments of its own medium, delivered in the language of comedy because the show has always understood that comedy is one of the most efficient delivery systems for uncomfortable truths. The show's awareness of its own position in television history has grown across its run in ways that are visible in the Easter eggs of the later seasons. A show that has been running for 36 years and that has contributed to the formation of the medium's contemporary identity has a different relationship to television history than a show that is simply part of it. The Simpsons is now a historical artifact as well as a current production, and the Easter eggs of the later seasons reflect this, showing a show that is aware of its own historicity, that is commenting on its place in the tradition, as well as on the tradition itself. This is the deepest form of television self-awareness available to a program, to understand that it will be watched differently in the future than it is watched now, that its meaning will shift as its context shifts, that the Easter eggs that are current references today will be historical references in the future, and to make choices accordingly. The Simpsons has been making choices accordingly for a long time. The result is a show that will continue to yield new material to attentive viewers indefinitely, a show that has been building toward its own future audience while serving its present one, a show that has hidden things for viewers who don't exist yet, who are not born yet, who will find them in 50 years and wonder who knew enough to put them there. Go to sleep now. You found enough for one night. Further, explorations, The Simpsons, and American memory. The Simpsons has spent 36 years constructing and reconstructing American memory. Not the official memory, not the history that gets taught in schools or commemorated in monuments, but the informal memory, the cultural memory, the memory of what American life felt like at specific moments, as experienced by the kind of people whose experience doesn't usually get preserved. Homer Simpson's experience of late 20th century and early 21st century American life is not a version of that experience that gets archived in official history. He is not important. He is not powerful. He does not make decisions that affect other people's lives in any significant way. He is one of the millions of ordinary Americans who lived through the period that the show has been documenting, and he is the one whose life the show chose to treat as worth watching, worth recording, worth examining with the kind of sustained attention that is usually reserved for lives that matter to the powerful. This choice is itself an Easter egg about the show's values. The decision to make Homer's life the subject, to treat the specific texture of a working-class man's experience as worthy of 36 years of careful comedic observation, is a political act expressed through narrative form. It says that ordinary experience is interesting, that ordinary people are worth watching, that the things that happen in a house on Evergreen Terrace are as worthy of attention as the things that happen in the corridors of power that Burns inhabits. The Easter egg is the sustained act of attention itself. The show's preservation of specific sensory details of American life across different eras constitutes an informal archive. The things that Homer eats, the cars that Springfield residents drive, the way houses are furnished, the specific visual texture of American commercial culture in each decade the show has passed through, all of this has been recorded in the background of every episode, accumulated into an inadvertent documentary of American material life across the late 20th and early 21st centuries. This archive is not the show's official purpose. It is the byproduct of the care with which the show's background designers treated the visual world of Springfield. But it is one of the things that will make the show valuable to people who watch it 100 years from now, when the world Homer inhabited is historical rather than contemporary. The Easter eggs that are references to contemporary culture, the things that were current when the episodes aired and that have since become historical, serve a specific function in this archival project. They mark the episode's moment in time. They say, this episode was made in this year, and this is what that year felt like, and these are the things that people were thinking about. The jokes that have dated are dated in a specific way that tells you exactly when they were made, which makes them valuable as documents even when they no longer function as jokes. The datedness is the Easter egg. The specific way that something has aged is information about the age it came from. Further explorations, the patience of hidden things. There is a specific quality to waiting that the best Easter eggs share. They are patient, they do not announce themselves, they do not become more obvious over time in order to be noticed. They simply exist in the frame, in the background, in the name, in the number, for however long it takes for the right viewer to come along. The Easter eggs in The Simpsons have been waiting for 36 years. Some of them have been found and documented and become part of the cultural record of the show. Others remain undiscovered, waiting for a specific viewer with a specific piece of knowledge who will watch a specific episode at a specific moment and suddenly understand what has been there since the beginning. This is the fundamental condition of hidden things. They wait, without impatience, until they are found. The makers of the show understood this when they hid things in it. They understood that the things they were hiding might not be found for years, or might never be found at all, and they hid them anyway, because the act of hiding something is itself a form of care, a way of saying that this thing matters enough to be preserved, to be given a future audience even if that audience is hypothetical. Every Easter egg in The Simpsons is a message in a bottle, a small act of hope that someone will look and find, that attention will be rewarded, that care will be recognized. This is why the Easter egg tradition of The Simpsons is, in the end, something more than a collection of hidden jokes. It is a record of people caring about the thing they were making, caring enough to put more into it than was required, to finish the surfaces that nobody would see, to write the fine print that nobody was supposed to read, to do the actual mathematics when a fake equation would have worked just as well. It is the evidence of a standard that was not imposed from outside, but generated from within, a collective agreement among hundreds of people across decades that Springfield deserved to be built as completely and as carefully as it was possible to build it. That agreement, maintained across 36 years and hundreds of episodes and thousands of individual creative decisions, is the show's most significant hidden thing, more significant than any specific equation or name or sign or background detail. The Easter eggs are the evidence of the agreement. The agreement is the thing itself, that Springfield was worth doing right, that the viewer who looked carefully deserved to find something, that the attention of the most attentive audience was worth honoring with the most careful craft. You have been paying attention. The show has been worth your attention. These two things, the attention and the worth, are what have kept the couch occupied and the chalkboard full, and the numbers in the background, and the names doing their quiet work for 36 years and counting. Sleep well. You've earned it. Further explorations, the secondary characters and their inner lives. Springfield is populated by a cast of secondary characters who, across the show's run, have each accumulated enough screen time and enough behavioral consistency that they constitute complete fictional human beings despite having had, in many cases, only minutes of total dialogue across the entire series. The character known as Comic Book Guy, whose real name is eventually revealed as Jeff Albertson, is one of the most carefully constructed secondary characters in the show's history. He is a portrait of a specific American type, the man who has chosen depth of knowledge in a narrow domain over breadth of social engagement, who has organized his life around the detailed mastery of a cultural artifact that the larger world considers trivial, and who expresses his relationship with the world primarily through evaluative comparison against the standard of his chosen archive. He is not a mockery of this type. He is an accurate portrait of it, including the loneliness, the intelligence, the genuine passion, and the specific defensiveness that comes from knowing that the thing you care most about is not taken seriously by most of the people you encounter. The Easter egg in Comic Book Guy is what he represents about the show's own audience. The Simpsons was, in its early seasons, consumed with the most intense attention by exactly the kind of viewers that Comic Book Guy represents, people who cared about the show with a passion disproportionate to its status as popular entertainment, who tracked its continuity and analyzed its jokes, and argued about its quality with the specificity that usually gets reserved for things the culture agrees matter. Comic Book Guy is the show's mirror, turned toward its own most devoted audience, made into a character whose defining characteristic is the excessive care with which he approaches the things he loves. He is the Easter egg that says, "We see you, we know who you are, and we are writing you into the show." Barney Gumble is another secondary character who contains more than he appears to. He is Homer's oldest friend, a man whose intellectual promise, glimpsed briefly in a single episode, was apparently lost to alcoholism in a trajectory that the show has depicted in brief, unflinching moments over the decades. The Easter egg in Barney is the life that is implied by his present condition but never fully shown. He was smart, he had potential. Something happened between that potential and the man at the bar, and the show has provided just enough information to sketch the outline of what happened without ever providing the full story. Barney is a portrait of lost possibility, rendered in the margins of a comedy, and the care with which those margins have been drawn is one of the show's most quiet achievements. Sideshow, Bob's Family, glimpsed in episodes where Bob's extended relationships become relevant to the plot, is an Easter egg about the nature of character formation. The Terwilliger family is theatrical, ambitious, educated, and constitutionally unable to accept the limitations that the world has placed on their greatness. Bob's criminality is the most extreme expression of this family character, but it is recognizable as an expression of it, continuous with what his brother and his father demonstrate through different means. The family is the Easter egg that explains the character, and the character is the Easter egg that explains the family. Further explorations episodes that change the show. There are specific episodes in The Simpsons' history that function as Easter eggs for the show's own development, episodes that mark a change in what the show was doing that was not announced but that is visible in retrospect. These episodes are the show's hidden turning points, and they reveal something about how creative development actually happens in a long-running television production. The episode where Homer gets a crayon removed from his brain and becomes briefly intelligent is one of these. On the surface, it is a comedy about Homer's relationship with his own cognitive limitations. But the episode contains, in the passages where Homer is intelligent and articulate and aware of the world around him, a portrait of what the show might have been if it had chosen to develop Homer's intelligence rather than his lovable incompetence. The Intelligent Homer episode is an Easter egg about an alternate version of the show, a version that was never made but that exists, briefly, within this single episode, as a glimpse of what the character contained that the usual format prevented. The episode where Marge is revealed to have had a gambling addiction is another hidden turning point, one that showed the show could sustain a genuine portrait of addiction without resolving it neatly or making it primarily comedic. The episode is funny in places, as Marge episodes usually are, but the portrait of addiction it develops is accurate enough and uncomfortable enough that it constituted a departure from the show's usual approach to character struggle. This episode is an Easter egg about the show's capacity for something heavier than its usual comedy, a capacity that the format generally suppresses but that occasionally surfaces in specific episodes that are willing to let the discomfort land without softening it into the punchline. The Lisa episodes that engage seriously with her intellectual and moral development are Easter eggs about the show's relationship with the kind of intelligence and seriousness that the format usually treats with comic irony. When the show allows Lisa to be right, to make an argument that the episode validates rather than undercuts, it is doing something that requires overriding the show's default orientation toward deflation of pretension. These episodes are harder to write than the ones where Lisa's idealism is the setup for a joke, and the care with which they're constructed is visible in the result. They are Easter eggs about the show's values, moments where the comedy is subordinated to the argument, because the argument is what the show actually wants to make. The episodes where the Simpson family's fundamental bond is genuinely tested, where the possibility of the family not surviving as a unit is made real enough to feel like a risk, are Easter eggs about the show's relationship with its own premise. The show's premise is that the family survives. Every episode confirms this. But certain episodes have made the survival feel conditional, have created genuine tension around whether the couch will still have 5 people on it by the time the credits roll, and these episodes are different in quality from the ones where the survival was never in doubt. The Easter egg in these episodes is the specific emotional engagement that genuine risk produces, the feeling that what you're watching might not end the way you expect, which is a feeling that the show's format usually forecloses, but that specific episodes have found ways to generate anyway. Further, explorations the show's long goodbye. The Simpsons has been in its long goodbye for at least 20 years. It has been saying goodbye in the background of its own episodes since the mid-aughts, when the critical consensus about its decline became loud enough to constitute a cultural fact, and when the show's own writers began to acknowledge, in the margins of episodes, that something had shifted. The Easter eggs of the goodbye are the most melancholy in the show's tradition. They are the moments where the show seems to know that it is no longer what it was, that the thing it has become is related to but different from the thing it used to be, that the audience it currently has is a different audience from the one that made it famous, watching it for different reasons with different expectations. These moments are visible in specific episodes in the later seasons, in moments where the show seems to be addressing its former self, speaking to the version of the show that used to make a specific kind of joke or tell a specific kind of story, noting the distance between that version and the current one. But the goodbye is also a refusal. The show keeps going. The chalkboard keeps getting sentences. The couch keeps getting found. The family keeps surviving the reset and appearing again the following week in exactly the same configuration. The going on is itself the goodbye, the specific form of going on that constitutes a refusal to end, a commitment to continuing that coexists with the awareness that the continuing is a kind of diminishment. The show is going on past its own best self, and it knows this, and it keeps going anyway, because the alternative is stopping, and stopping is a kind of death, and the show has been in the business of refusing death since Homer walked away from that vending machine. The Easter egg in the long goodbye is the persistence. The fact that after 36 seasons and more than 750 episodes, the show is still finding things to say in the background of its frames, still naming things carefully, still making the equations work, still building a world that is worthy of the attention of its most attentive viewers. The persistence is not proof that the show is still as good as it was. It is proof that the people making it still care enough to try. And the trying, documented in the Easter eggs, in the hidden material, in the care with which the background of each frame is constructed, is the show's most enduring statement about itself. It cares. It has always cared. It will keep caring until the day it finally stops. And until that day, the chalkboard will have a sentence, the couch will have a gag, and in the background of some scene you haven't watched yet, something will be written on a wall, waiting for you to find it. Rest now. You've been looking for a long time. Further explorations, The Simpsons and the dream of belonging. There is something underneath every Easter egg in The Simpsons, something that the hidden jokes and the careful background details and the precise mathematical equations and the thoughtfully chosen character names are all expressions of. It is the desire to be in a place that rewards knowing it well, to be part of something that gets better the more attention you pay to it, to have the experience of discovering that a world you thought you knew contains more than you realized. This is the dream of belonging, not the belonging that comes from being admitted to something, but the belonging that comes from understanding something, from having spent enough time with it and enough attention on it that it has opened itself to you in ways that it doesn't open to everyone. The Easter eggs are the mechanism of this belonging. They are the show's way of saying, if you have been paying attention, there is more here for you, there is a level of this that is yours if you want it, there is a relationship between you and this thing that goes deeper than the casual encounter. This is why the Easter egg tradition of The Simpsons matters beyond the individual discoveries it enables. It is the architecture of a community, the infrastructure of a shared attention, the thing that makes long-term viewers of the show more than just people who have watched a lot of television. It makes them people who know Springfield, who have the specific knowledge that comes from sustained engagement with a world that was built to reward that engagement. The Easter eggs are the show's gift to this community, the thing that the show gives back to the viewers who have given it their time and their attention. The community of people who watch The Simpsons carefully, who notice the things hidden in the background, who track the show's internal references and the mathematical Easter eggs and the celebrity subtext and the chalkboard's coded messages, is itself one of the most interesting communities in the history of popular culture. It is a community organized around the shared project of knowing something well, of paying the kind of attention that most people reserve for things the culture agrees are important to the study of something the culture classifies as entertainment. It is a community that has decided, collectively, that entertainment can be worth the kind of sustained, serious attention that we normally reserve for art. This decision is not wrong. The Simpsons is worth that attention. The Easter eggs are the evidence that the attention is warranted, that there is something there to find when you look carefully enough. And the community of people who look carefully is the most eloquent argument that the decision to look was right. The show will run until it stops. The Easter eggs will be there until they are found. The background will contain things that have been waiting for the right viewer since the year the episode was made. And the viewers will keep watching, keep pausing, keep noticing, keep finding, because that is what the show was built for. That is the relationship it was designed to enable, and that is the thing that 36 years of careful, attentive, passionate work has made possible. You are part of this. You have been paying attention. You are exactly the viewer the show was always talking to, behind the jokes and the characters and the plots, in the margins and the backgrounds and the fine print. The show knows you're there. It always has. Sleep. Springfield will be here when you wake up, and there will be something in the background you haven't found yet. There always is. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield. Drop your location and time in the comments, and tell me which Easter egg surprised you most. The next one is already being built. Further explorations. 36 years of Sunday nights. There is a specific ritual that has organized Sunday nights for millions of American households since December of 1989. 8 o'clock. The couch, the credits. The family assembled on screen as you are assembled in your living room. The opening of the show that has been opening at this time, in this way, for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. The ritual is the Easter egg, not any specific element of it, not the chalkboard or the couch gag or the particular opening notes of Danny Elfman's theme, but the whole thing, the entire experience of knowing what is about to happen and then having it happen, of being inside a ritual that has been observed so many times that it has become part of the temporal architecture of your life. For the people who have watched The Simpsons since its beginning, 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening has a specific texture that it wouldn't have without the show. The show has made that time mean something. This is one of the things that the Easter egg tradition honors. The eggs hidden in the show are not just there for the individual viewer who finds them. They are there for the community of viewers who have been organizing their Sunday evenings around this ritual for decades, who have given the show the kind of sustained attention that makes Easter eggs findable in the first place. The hidden things are a gift to the people who showed up. And the people who showed up, week after week, year after year, for 36 years, are themselves a kind of miracle, a community organized around a sustained act of attention that has outlasted most of the other things that organized American life in the same period. The show that Homer watches in the living room, in the scenes where he's sitting on that couch watching television, is a mirror of the relationship between the show and its audience. Homer watches television with total commitment, with complete emotional availability, with the specific kind of uncritical engagement that makes television work. He is not analyzing. He is not distanced. He is in it entirely for as long as it lasts. This is not what critics do, but it might be what television is actually for, what the medium achieves at its best. The total engagement of a person with a story that is happening to them in real time, that is being received rather than observed. The show has been happening to its audience in real time for 36 years. The Easter eggs are the evidence that the show has been paying equal attention to the audience paying attention to it, that the relationship has been mutual, that the care has gone in both directions. The show was careful with you. You were careful with it. And in that mutual care, across all those Sunday evenings and all those episodes and all those hidden things found and still waiting to be found, something happened that is not very common in the relationship between audiences and entertainment. Something that felt real. Something that felt like it mattered. Something that felt, in the best moments, like being known. Further explorations, the hidden history of Springfield's economy. The economic history of Springfield is one of the show's most carefully maintained Easter eggs, documented across hundreds of episodes in background details that, taken together, constitute a complete portrait of the economic conditions of a mid-size American town across the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The plant dominates Springfield's economy in ways that the show depicts consistently and without sentimentality. When the plant is doing well, Springfield is doing well. When Burns makes decisions that affect the plant's output or workforce, those decisions ripple through the town in ways that are visible in the background of subsequent episodes. Stores that close, businesses that open, the specific visual texture of prosperity and decline that the show's background designers have rendered with sociological accuracy. The Quickie Mart's economic history is itself a complete story about the transformation of American retail across the decades the show has covered. In the early episodes, the Quickie Mart represents a specific kind of small-scale neighborhood commerce. The corner store, the family business, the place that exists because the neighborhood needs it and has always had it. As the show has continued, the visual environment around the Quick E-Mart has changed in ways that reflect the changing commercial landscape around real small American businesses across the same period. The arrival of big box retail is visible in background establishing shots. The specific pressures on small businesses are documented in the Quick E-Mart's own changing visual condition across seasons. Homer's relationship to labor economics is one of the show's most sustained Easter egg traditions. He works at the plant not because it is a good job, but because it is a job, and the distinction between those two things, between employment and meaningful work, between the paycheck and the purpose, is one of the show's deepest recurring subjects. The Easter egg in Homer's work is the specific way that he relates to his labor, the combination of genuine incompetence and genuine effort, of not caring about his work in any abstract sense, and caring enormously about the specific daily experience of being at work, of having a place to be and people who know him, and a routine that structures his time. This is a portrait of a specific relationship to work that is common and rarely depicted with accuracy. The relationship of someone who works not because the work means something, but because working means something. Because having a job is part of having a life, and having a life is the only goal that Homer has ever been fully committed to. The Easter egg is in the specificity, in the fact that the show has been accurate about this relationship for 36 years, that Homer's attitude toward work is not lazy or satirical but genuinely observed, drawn from real knowledge of what it feels like to have a job that you don't love but that is part of who you are. Springfield's informal economy, the jobs that characters do outside their official employment, the favors and trades and under-the-table arrangements that constitute a significant portion of how actual economies function, is another layer of the show's economic Easter egg tradition. Characters in Springfield have multiple economic identities, official positions, and actual practices that don't always align, and the gap between those identities is one of the show's most consistent observations about how American economic life actually works versus how it is officially described. The Easter egg is in the gap, in what the background shows you about the real economy of Springfield that the foreground narrative only occasionally acknowledges. The show's treatment of Springfield's economic decline and partial recovery across its run mirrors the economic history of real mid-size American industrial towns across the same period, with enough accuracy to constitute commentary. The Springfield that exists in the show's later seasons is economically different from the Springfield of the early seasons, and these differences are documented in the background detail rather than announced in the plot. The stores that have closed, the buildings that have been repurposed, the specific visual texture of a town that has been through something and is in the process of figuring out what comes next. This is the background Easter egg tradition at its most sustained and its most meaningful, the show using the accumulation of visual detail to tell a story about economic change that it has never made the explicit subject of any episode. Final reflection on paying attention? Every Easter egg in The Simpsons is a small act of faith. Faith that someone will look. Faith that the detail placed in the background of a frame will be found by the viewer who needs to find it. Faith that the name chosen with care will be read by someone who understands why it was chosen. Faith that the equation worked out correctly will be checked by someone who knows enough to check it. This faith is not always rewarded immediately. Some Easter eggs are found years after they were placed. Some have never been found at all, sitting in frames that have been watched millions of times without anyone noticing. But the faith that placed them there was not conditional on immediate discovery. It was the unconditional faith of craft, the belief that doing something right is worth doing even when no one is watching, that the work justifies itself through its own integrity rather than through its reception. The Simpsons has maintained this faith across 36 years and hundreds of thousands of individual creative decisions. Every choice to get a detail right when a wrong detail would have worked just as well. Every choice to put something in the background that would only be visible at a pause. Every choice to do the actual mathematics rather than the plausible symbol arrangement. Every choice to give a minor character a name that does real work rather than a name that merely fills the space. These choices, accumulated across 36 years, are the show's character. They are who the show is. And the Easter eggs are the evidence, the visible residue of the choices, the things that remain after the decisions have been made, waiting in the background of frames that will be watched and rewatched for as long as the show is preserved. You have been watching. You have been the answer to the faith. And now you can go to sleep knowing that the world you just spent time in was built by people who cared enough to build it right, who put things in the corners for you even when they knew you might not find them, who believed in your attention enough to reward it with something worth finding. Rest. The background is still there. Springfield is still standing. And there is still more, in the margins of frames you haven't reached yet, patient as the town itself, waiting for the next time you decide to look.